great.
And it's got like 5 cameras.
Yeah.
You know.
So I want to just give a little bit of overview about No Left Turn. No Left Turn was started back east in Pennsylvania about 2 years ago. And what we do is we look at critical race theory, or CRT, and transgender issues. What we try to do is we try to bring a different perspective, looking at it from more of a moderate point of view. We're not here to go to the complete far left or the complete far right. We're trying to bring everybody to the middle to look at this, and look at this how it affects our schools. Here in Lamorinda, our group was started by a guy, unfortunately he's not here, and David, and he basically is very well read. And this is probably one of the best well-read groups in the state. I haven't experienced that here. So there's a bunch of concerned parents. They've put a lot of time and brought these speakers together because of their great knowledge. And just trying to bring it to the forefront so everybody understands that we need to come together as a community, and communities all throughout California, because I'm the California chapter head. We're trying to bring this to a place where we can maybe affect change in your school districts, and just kind of pointing it out so you can look at it and make your own mind up. One of the things that's lacking in our schools is a little bit of critical thinking. We need to be able to think about these problems constructively and see how we can come together, because there's a lot of things going on right now. There's a critical race theory, there's woke math, which is a completely different experience. Like the framework of math used to be 66% last year, it's 6% this year. The rest of it's all these polite terms in there instead of actually doing math. There's a transgender issue. We have a district here, and we've actually uncovered papers here about gender changing. There's actually a lawsuit going on down in Salinas. But some of these things are very serious. But what we wanted to bring was kind of an overview to what this is in the package. It's just overwhelming for most people, but we hope to accomplish, just kind of give you a picture from some experts' perspectives, and just kind of open your minds up to thinking about it and what we can do next. Thanks. So I have Neil start. Neil Mammen, he's from Every Black Lives Matter, and we're looking forward to his talk on the
Great, thank you. How's the audio here? Great, well, thank you for inviting me. I want to talk today about social justice. People talk about social justice all the time, but I want to compare it and understand how does it differ if it does between what we want is true justice, right? Because that's what we want. We want true justice. For instance, is it social justice to discriminate against somebody based on the color of their skin? Some people say it is, some people say it isn't. But is it true justice to discriminate against somebody based on the color of their skin? Is it social justice to make sure everybody has free health care? Some people say it is, some people say it isn't. So we want to understand all that. Well, let me start by asking you guys a trick question. Do you have constitutional rights? Yes. Okay, this is a trick question, and you'll see why I said that. Now, I was born at a very young age in Ghana, in Africa, and I was brought up with a mix of Indian and African cultures. I'm ethnically Indian, but I grew up in Ghana, Jamaica, Sudan, Ethiopia, Yemen, India, and Yemen. So that kind of gives you a bit of my background. I've been through all the cultures, I've experienced all the different religions, and in Yemen we grew up, while I was there, my dad was working there as a professor, and Yemen has Sharia law, so I've grown up under Sharia law as well. And well, I want to tell you a quick story of what was happening when we were in Yemen. One day my father's friends came to him. He had some friends in the government, and they came to him urgently and they said, "You have to leave." And we said, "We can buy you 2 weeks, you have to leave the country." Why? Because it turns out that a co-worker of my father had picked up a Bible that was sitting at his desk at the university and had borrowed it without him knowing it. And apparently, as we found out, it is against the law to give someone, it's illegal to give someone who's not a Christian a Bible in Yemen. So we left the country under threat of death. But let me ask you this. If you want to give somebody a Bible and they want to take it, should you be able to do it? Of course. In any culture, right? If you want a Bible and somebody's willing to sell it to you, should you be able to get it? Yeah. Or a Quran or anything, right? So do you have the right to give somebody else something you own? Yes. Well, where do rights come from? In Islamic countries, you don't have unalienable rights. You certainly don't have the right to talk about religion or politics, and you certainly don't have a right to give a Muslim a Bible. The government in Yemen thinks they give you rights. The right to talk to others about your religion is not one of the rights they give you. But let me ask you this. Do our rights come from government? Do our rights come from the Constitution? What are some of the dangers if our rights are given to us by the government? They can take them away. In fact, they can take away. If rights came from the government, then they can legally take away those same rights for any made-up reason, like for your safety. And we've seen that a lot. In fact, governments all over the world take away rights, and it's always under, well, we want to take care of you. It's always under the guise of, we need to protect you from whatever it is. But we see that as really dangerous when rights come from the government. So, do your rights come from the Constitution? No, and remember my trick question. Does the Bill of Rights give you rights? No. In fact, the trick question was, do you have constitutional rights? No, you don't have constitutional rights. I don't mean they were taken away from you. I mean you never had them, because the Constitution doesn't give you rights. The Constitution is a list of negative rights that says the government can't do these things. There's not a single right that the Constitution assigns to you. There were a few given later, but it was misworded. It should have said the government cannot infringe, cannot stop people from voting if they're human beings and they're citizens, right? But it can't give you any rights. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights is a list of negative rights. It's not a list of rights that you have. So we know that the government can't stop you, can't give you rights. So I don't get it from the government. Can I give myself rights? Can I walk around and say, I'm emperor, you have to obey me? No, why? Because I don't have the authority. Can I tell this gentleman here, well, how to treat this lady here? No, because I don't have authority over either of them. So obviously I can't give myself rights. Now, let me ask you this. So where do rights come? Can the rights come from the masses? A lot of people think, oh, rights come from the masses. I was on a debate just a few days ago, and somebody said, oh, rights come from a social contract. I said, really? So the slaves had a social contract? They said, no, rights come from the masses. I'm like, so the masses, well, here's the problem with that. If the masses voted back before the 1800s, the masses voted that slaves had no rights. Now, did slaves have no rights? Or did slaves always actually have rights? But what was happening is, these rights were constantly being violated, and it wasn't until the majority of the state recognized those pre-existing rights that justice was restored. So where did their rights come from? They obviously don't come from the masses. What does the Declaration of Independence say? The Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be what? Self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their government, by the masses, by themselves. No, by what? By their creator with certain unalienable rights, and amongst these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Why did we get there? Why is it self-evident? Let me tell you why it's self-evident. Because I just proved to you, it just can't come from those last three people. The only way that I could tell somebody to do something is if I have moral authority over them. So who has moral authority over the slave owner to tell them that you have to treat the slave equally? Who has moral authority over Hitler that says you have to treat the Jews equally? Who has moral authority over every single human being that says you have to treat every single other human being equally? Who's that? It's the Creator. And that's why it says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, because we just got there without using the Bible, by just using logic. If there are rights, then there has to be a Creator, right? So rights come from a Creator. Now, here's the problem, though. If I have no Creator, I have no unalienable rights. Then all I have is rights that came about by violence. And it's not a moral right. In which case, you can't complain that the slaves didn't have rights. You can just say some nice white people decided to give some enslaved black people rights. And that's frankly racist. Now here's the problem, though. Notice I grew up in Africa, in the Middle East, in India. You see, the Muslim God does not give people rights. The 3 million Hindu gods do not give people rights. There's none of the other religions' gods give people rights. There's only one religion who says that God makes everybody, all mankind, equal. And that's the Judeo-Christian Bible. So it's not only important that you understand where the rights come from, but it's also important which kind of God that you think the rights are bestowed upon you. And these are two things that you can't separate. You separate that, and then you end up with tyranny. And if you look at that around the globe, you will see that. And I've lived under some of those tyrannical governments. Okay, so what then is the purpose of government? If government doesn't give you rights, why do I need a government? Anybody know? Suggestions? You're all afraid now because I tricked you a few times. To protect our rights. What does the Declaration say? To secure those rights, governments are instituted amongst men. Right? Okay, let's play a game. Because some people say healthcare is a right. Some people say everybody should have vacations. That's a right. Some people say that equal pay is a right, right? Some people say that schooling is a right. It's a right to have schools, right? Okay, so what are rights? So we'll play a little game and we'll see what are rights. And I'm going to flash up a little thing up here. And again, there's some trick questions here. So on one side we have the rights, and on the other side we have something else. I'm going to flash something else and you tell me if it's a right or not. Okay, the first one. Is this a right? Now in Texas, everybody goes, yes! California, somebody are like, I'm not sure. Well, folks, this is not a right, this is a gun. Now there is a right tied to that, isn't there? What's the right? The right is to bear arms. Now understand the right to bear arms and gun ownership is just the right that the the Bill of Rights tells you about. But you don't need a right. You have the inalienable right to protect yourself.
Yes.
Right? So you don't need a declaration or a constitution to tell you have the right to protect yourself. And if your neighbor has a gun, you get a gun. Your neighbor has a cannon, you get a cannon. Right? It's quite simple. The founding fathers knew that. Right? So the question is, quite simply this, if that's the right to bear arms, why is this not a right? Because you're not entitled to be given a gun the day you're born. When you're born, your neighbors have to gather around, and are they supposed to pay for you to buy a new gun? No. You have to get your own gun. You have the right to own that gun, but you have to buy your own gun. Okay, how about this? Freedom of speech, is this all right? Some of you guys are, well, he got it a few times. Yes, it's a right. It really is a right. But what about this? It's a printing press. When I do this to junior high, they're like, I have no idea what a printing press is. But is a printing press a right? Do you have a right to a printing press? No. You have a right to buy your own printing press, but you're not entitled to be given a printing press the minute you're born. You have to what? You have to buy it. You have to borrow it. You have to give, or do you have a right to a website? No. If you give up all your information and your buying habits to Google, they'll give you a website for free. But you're buying it, right? So that's right. Okay, so that's not a right. Okay, now let's look at a few of these. We've got, and these are, let me tell me what these are. Home ownership, a job, healthcare, food, clothing. Are these rights or something else? There's a trick question in. There's one right in there. Do you see it? Home ownership. You have the right to own a home, but you have to buy your own home. Okay? Now, let's look at this. What is the difference? Why am I pushing on this, and what am I trying to explain? Well, here's how it is. Here's how you explain. I want to give you tools to understand the difference between rights and the something else. Rights are something that the Creator gives you. Okay? Freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, freedom to move around the country. Or maybe that's a Southwest commercial. But you understand the point, right? That's the right. What's the something else? The something else is what we call goods and services. It's the product of somebody's labor. Anytime something is the product of somebody's labor, it's a good or a service. You see, here's the problem. Let's say you say education is a right. Where are you going to get that education from? Are you going to go out and capture a bunch of teachers, whip them until they give you a free education? Right? You can't. Well, you can. Here's what we do. We don't do that. We capture everybody, take 30% of their income, and then force them to give free education, free healthcare, free everything else to everybody else. Same thing with healthcare. Well, you're going to capture a bunch of doctors and whip them until they give you free healthcare. It's a product of somebody's labor. And what happens when you forcibly take somebody's labor away from them? What's it called?
Cuban doctor.
It's called slavery. It's called, you have a right to your own goods. It's called stealing, but not to somebody else's good. That's stealing. That's a sin, and that's logic. So in the same way, as soon as something's a product of somebody else's work, it becomes a good and not a right. You always have a right to your own goods and services. You have a God-given inalienable right, but not to somebody else. And it doesn't matter how noble those things are. Eventually you have to enslave somebody or some group of people to take those goods and services to give to another group of people. In the same way, nobody's entitled to a job. What are you going to do? Take a whip and force employers to hire people? Well, what happens is they just quit. They just go out of business. And where's that employer going to get the money for you? Is he going to forcibly force his customers to pay you and by whipping them? No, they're going to say, no, I don't want any more of this. So here's the thing. Goods are granted as rights. Require you to enslave men financially or physically to ensure a continuous supply of the goods that you have promised to others. And this is all logical. We've just gotten here logically. No, don't get me wrong. Taxes or fees for services is great, and we need that. For instance, you own a car, you pay fees to use the road. You have a house, you pay fees for police protection, or fire protection, or sewage. But that's fees for services. Fees for services are always good. But today, our property tax doesn't go for fees for services. It goes for a whole host of things that you probably have no say in. Now, okay, what about the poor? You know, I come from a Christian background, as you can tell, and often I get this. Oh, you know, Jesus said take care of the poor. James, if you recall, says true religion includes taking care of widows and orphans. And this is where we get the idea of charities. It was the first charity came from there. In fact, some people reading that say, well, Jesus was a socialist. But was he a socialist? Let's understand that all these ideas come from the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, you remember the story of the Good Samaritan? There's the Good Samaritan. He's walking down the street, and he sees a guy that's been beaten up. He takes the guy, and he takes him to an innkeeper. He takes him to the innkeeper, and he says, Mr. Innkeeper, here's a guy that I found on the street. Here's some money to take care of him. You please take care of him. When I come back, I want you to pay the other half, because it's only fair that we share. No, people are laughing because that's not the story. Actually, what the story is, he says, here's Mr. Innkeeper's guy, here's half of the money. When I come back, I'm going to bring some goons, they're going to beat up all your neighbors, take money from them and pay for the poor guy. He didn't say that, did he? What did he say? He said, when I come back, I'm going to bring IRS agents with badges. They're going to go to all your neighbors, collect tax, and then we're going to pay for the poor guy. He didn't say that either. What did he say? He says, when I come back, who will pay for it? I will pay for it. Jesus said, you voluntarily give to the poor, not force your neighbor to. You see, socialism is nothing more than forcing your neighbor to give you to your favorite charity at the point of a government agent's gun. And you go, well, Neil, that's not possible for the church to take care of people. Well, we've been doing it for the last 2,000 years. I was on a radio show a few years ago, and this lady came up, and I mentioned all this, and she started laughing at me. She said, and she was a caller, she called in, and she said, you're just mean-spirited and evil. And I said, why? She says, well, because you think that people, that your church can take care of the poor. He said, maybe in Africa that's okay. I said, well, that's kind of derogatory of you. And I said, ma'am, can I ask you a story? She said, what? Oh, no. Then she said, well, last week I was in my hospital. And my doctor had the latest MRI and CAT scan equipment. You're telling me that your church can do that? I said, ma'am, can I ask you a question? She goes, what? I said, do you mind telling me the name of your hospital? Long silence. I said, ma'am, could you tell us the name of your hospital? Long silence. The host, who's a liberal, right, against everything I stand for probably, says, ma'am, will you answer Mr. Mammen's question? And she goes, he says, well, tell us the name of your hospital. She goes, St. James, but that's not important. I said, ma'am, that hospital was started by Christians. Most hospitals were started by Christians. The reason the Christians have moved out of it is because they've been forced out of it, and the government stepped in and said, you have to pay, give everybody free health care. And the way you get expensive health care is you let the government give it away for free. And Ronald Reagan said, if you want sand to be impossible to get and very expensive, have the government give it away for free. Because guess what happens? Some crony capitalist gets in there, some corporatist gets in there, says we can't give away any free sand. We have to give graded government sand. What if somebody gets sick? And guess what? I'll have the contract to grade the government sand. Which means that you can't have people just going to the beach and picking up sand, so that becomes illegal. And I'll sell the sand to the government for this amount. And if anybody else wants sand, they have to compete with the government for it, and guess what? And that's exactly what's happening with healthcare. Okay, so how do I tell the difference between, so these are saying it's not the state's job to take care of the poor, it's the church's job. Okay, how do I tell the difference? Well, quite simple. Ask yourself, is it right or is goods or services? If it's rights, then it's an issue of true justice. If it's goods or labor, then it's not justice, it's stealing. And going through this, It's a right, there's issue of true justice. If it's goods or services, then it's not justice, it's stealing. So now going through a list, I'm just put up a few of these, but I just want to give you a template of how do you look at things and say, is it social justice or is it true justice? So I've just picked up a few. I've kept off the more controversial ones because I don't have time. I only have 20 minutes here, and that will take us an hour to cover. But if you do bring it up in the Q&A, I might be willing to answer some of that. Okay, so justice issues, right? Let's look at some. Healthcare. Medical equality. Now, think about this. In light of what I've told you and the logic and the rationale I've told you, is healthcare a social justice issue? How about minimum wage? Social justice issue. How about economic equality? Everybody gets paid the same thing. Is that a social justice issue? How about hunger and food insecurity? Is that a social justice issue, or is that a goods? How about gender or ethnic or color diversity in the marketplace? Is that a social justice, or is it based on hiring who's the best one? Let's go through this. Go through these. Okay, first of all, healthcare and medical equality. We already said that's a service, right? Goods and services. So if you start assigning it as everybody gets healthcare, guess what? Who's paying for it? You're taking it from somebody else. Okay, how about minimum wage? Did you know that minimum wage laws came because of the KKK? I wrote a book with my daughter. It's called, she's 8. She was 8 at the time. It's called Does Every Black Life Matter? And we go through this and we explain that the minimum wage was started by racists in the 1930s. In the 1930s, blacks were at the height of discrimination. Jim Crow laws, right, were all over, yet the literacy rate in the black communities was 70%. They were doing well. In fact, 6 of the airplanes in Oklahoma Airport were owned by black people. Okay? Not in the 30s, obviously, but later on when airplanes became common. And yet, and fatherlessness was only about 22%. Now, guess what happens? Why was that the case? Well, because the black men would go to a racist store owner or a racist construction company owner and he'd say, look, I know you're paying the white men this much. I will work for half of it. And of course, the racist construction owner goes, hey, green is better than anything, and I want my money. I don't care about you. I'll pay you your half of the wages, and I'll make more money, right? I'm going to have a great increase in my profit. And so they did that, and then the blacks men would take that income, they would go to their home communities, they would build up. In fact, I was just talking to one of the 4 men who in our every EBLM, we interviewed the gentleman who was sitting at the counter, at the Woolworths counter, and he said, yeah, we had dentists, we had lawyers, we had all this in our black community. And then they passed a minimum wage law. Why? Because the KKK came and said, you know, we don't like this. We don't like the fact that black men are taking white jobs, so guess what? We will start a minimum wage, and guess what the minimum wage was? Oh, it was amazingly the minimum wage that white men were willing to accept. So now you're a racist store owner, and a black man comes and says, I'll work for half, so I can't pay you half because I'll get in trouble with the police or with the law. And all those jobs dropped off. And that's happening today. And what happens today with the literacy rate in some of the inner city schools, I was just in Chicago on E-Block, interviewing a pastor there, and our group was out there. And the pastor said, you know, the literacy rate in Chicago is about 4%. That means 96% of the kids leave school without being able to read or write. Now you tell me how they're going to get a $15 an hour job. They can't even run the balance sheet. They can't even order new parts or supplies or anything. So Thomas Sowell says the minimum wage, very cleverly, is misnamed. The real minimum wage is 0. That is what many inexperienced and low-skilled people receive as a result of legislation that makes it legal to pay them what they're currently worth when employed. You got to start them low and let them earn whatever they can earn, and let it grow. Okay. Let's keep going. Economic equality. This means that you make sure some people aren't too rich or too poor. But when you start equalizing results, you actually cause more problems. You actually start degrading certain communities, and the black community has experienced this far greater than any other experience because they just don't get hired, or they get hired out of their league and then they get fired because they can't make it, or they get advanced into colleges where they can't compete and they leave. There are more black kids dropping out of colleges because they're not able to compete with the other kids because they were gotten there without having that education. We think this is a huge disservice to them. And then you take away somebody's opportunity to give to another person's opportunity just because you want to see a color thing. This is, you look at me and you say an Indian, I'm really an African, but if Indians are all over the place, right? Why? Because they have the toughest standards in India, right? And they come here and they excel. Why? But if people were hiring Indians just because they thought, oh, we needed a color diversity, when I walked around, people would go, he's only here because he's Indian, not because he's really good. And blacks feel the same way in our community. Okay, let's keep going. So hunger and food insecurity, we've already talked about that. Quite simply that you can't, if you want to get food, you go through charities, and charities are 6 times more efficient, and I don't have time to go there, but we've proven that a charity is 6 times more efficient than the government. For every dollar you give to a charity, only 15 cents, 85 cents will get to a poor person. For every dollar you give to the government in taxes, only 15 cents gets to the poor person who needs it. We're 6 times more efficient. Okay, and then of course, we get to gender, ethnic, or color diversity. It's all the same thing. Somebody came and said, look, what about women get, only 80% of what men make? I said, how come nobody told me that? Because I started 4 companies. I would hire all women. That gives me a 20% advantage. Why would I hire a stupid guy if a woman can do the same thing? Right? I put 21, I would have, my companies would have done far better. The profit margins, the stocks would have gone higher. Right? Okay, so let's look at the true justice and rights issues real quick. And again, these are slavery. Slavery is a true justice. It exists in many Islamic countries. A lot of sex slavery is going on. Even in America, there's a lot of kids being captured for sex slavery. It's something we need to stop immediately. We need to fight it. It's all over. True racial injustice. We need to be very careful about this. There are far too many things that attribute to racism, and it's not. We don't, at EBLM, Every Black Lives Matter, we don't believe there are races. We think there's only one race, and that is the human race. Really, there are multiple cultures and multiple ethnicities. But we're all one race. And when you discriminate against another person, you're discriminating against ethnicity, and that's a problem. Okay, so we talk about, in the book here, we talk about the real issues. Why is there black plight today? And you can see that you can attribute to one thing that happened in the 1970s when they decided to give welfare to mothers and more money when there's no father in the home. I talked to a lady who was in that era back then in the 70s. She said her mom and her aunt would get calls, and their social worker would come in and says, if there is no man in this house, you will get more money. And there was like hiding shoes. Because back then, those days they would have to come and visit. She said, I got to write you up that there's a man in the house. And she said, my aunt would get calls saying, you should kick him out of the house. Now there's a 70% fatherlessness in the African American community, which leads to drugs and gangs and violence and school problems. And why do you think the school literacy rate is so low? It's because they have lots of violence and gangs in it. We talk about it all in here. Okay. Next, religious persecution. In schools, we have, Christians in the Middle East and India being persecuted. The Muslims are being persecuted in China. Governments are instituted to secure rights, but many governments are not doing that. And so we have to watch out for that. Selective genocide in the womb. If you think about it, there are 44 million African Americans today. There would have been 64 million. 20 million. That means 50% more African Americans. There would have been 50% more African, but they were killed before they could even be born. I don't know where you stand on abortion, but this is a genocide. And why? It's a government-paid genocide. The government has funded all 20 million of those babies being killed. Okay. Yeah.
We need to wrap it up.
Yeah. So the last 2 things is the forced labor. We've got forced dangerous child labor. We've got all these things, a lot of the new things that we talk about with electric vehicles. Turns out that they all come from this child labor. And then finally, let me close with this. Free market rights. One of the free market rights is you've got to be able to pay a person. That's the whole minimum wage thing we talked about. And then suppressing rights based on color. And I just want to spend a few seconds on this. It's very dangerous for a minority to allow the government to uphold their rights at the expense of the majority's rights. Because one day the tables will turn. And that's one thing I, who have always been a minority in all the countries I've lived in a sense, have always worried about. That if they uphold us higher than the locals, one day that will turn and we will be the ones attacked. We saw that in Iraq. We've seen that in many other countries like that. So let me close like this. If you look at what Christians have done in the last 2,000 years, we have involved in true justice, and we've changed it. Sorry. Whoops. We have stopped slavery, racism, segregation, kidnap rights, child labor, total conflict, infanticide. All these laws and thousands of others were only implemented because Christians stood up. Not one of them were implemented by any other religion. They were because Christians stood up and changed the laws. They got involved in politics and they changed the laws in their country. So here's my question. If we don't fight for these rights, what will happen? In a few years, what will happen is I will have to tell my daughter or my son, we have to leave this country. Why? Because it's illegal to get someone who's not a Christian in the Bible in the United States of America. And gentlemen and ladies, that's not that happened yet. We have to understand the difference between justice and social justice. Thank you.
So next we're going to have Lisa Logan, and she's going to set up her computer in just a minute. She's going to talk about sinister SEL. Lisa is from Utah, and she's become a well-versed in SEL, and so we're going to hear a little bit about what she does.
You guys switch slides on this.
You need a mic?
Use the podium since I don't have a cool face mic like that. Hello everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. It really feels good to be back in my home state. I'm actually a longtime California resident, and I jumped ship to Utah about 10 years ago. And, you know, I truly miss the beaches and the sunsets, but in reality I did it because, you know, Utah has a lot of great values, and as much as they have some pretty awful education issues going on there as well, which is why I'm involved in this fight, California has really bought all in on using education to indoctrinate children into a particular worldview. And any guesses on what that worldview is and where it's coming from? Anybody? Shout it out.
Marxist.
Okay, yeah?
Warming.
You're going down the right direction. So I'm going to give you, 1 second. Helpful if I turn it on. So I'm going to give you a few hints here, and it's from the Lafayette School District Strategic Plan. It says, quote, students should meet the challenges of an environmentally sustainable global economy, that they should be prepared to engage as global citizens, that actively participate in a global society and an interconnected ecosystem, and that they understand the global impact of local, national, and international events and developments so they can understand their role in creating a sustainable future. So what word did you hear me say like a gazillion times?
Global.
Exactly, global. Now, another two phrases I want to bring your attention to in here is, quote, deepening their focus on social emotional learning, and also focusing on data to measure student progress. Now, I'm here today to tell you why all those words are significant, not just to Lafayette School District and not just to the surrounding districts, but to school districts across the nation. Essentially, all of these inside and outside forces listed here that push social emotional learning into schools are part of a larger global agenda to control the values, attitudes, and beliefs of children. And they decide which ones they need to have. So right about now you should be asking yourself, who gets to identify which of these values, attitudes, and beliefs are the correct ones, and how are they going to be measured? I'm glad you asked. So, call me crazy to think that because you're the parent that you have the right, the fundamental right, to decide what values, attitudes, and beliefs your offspring should have. Crazy, right? through social emotional learning programs, the right to decide those things gets shifted, and not just to local and national governments, but by entities that partner with local and national organizations to bring the UN's worldview to your child's classroom. They're pretty open about the fact that they want to use social and emotional learning in order to do this. These programs were planned from their inception to be the vehicle for all sorts of social injustice issues, social and racial justice, and also other UN-based initiatives like promoting socialism over capitalism, advocating for environmentalism to combat climate change, comprehensive sexuality education, and teaching gender education, gender theory, gender fluidity, whatever you want to call it. Its goal is to erase gender norms. So UNESCO at the top there, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, wants to see its 2030 Sustainable Development Goals through to completion. They're the goals that they set over a 15-year period of time. Right now it's 2015 to 2030 that directs all their funding and their efforts. And they specifically are in charge of SDG 4, which is quality and inclusive education for all. While UNESCO claims its role as promoting world peace and security through international cooperation in the sciences, education, and culture, they're also one of the prime supporters of comprehensive sexuality education, which, as most of you know, is far more comprehensive than any of us would really like, right? They teach 8 and 9-year-olds about masturbation. That's how early they believe children should be sexual, and even earlier than that, really. They also partner with the International Planned Parenthood Federation. So one of their stated main goals is a thing called global citizenship education. According to UNESCO, global citizenship education, or GCED, aims to empower learners of all ages to assume active roles both locally and globally in building more peaceful, tolerant, inclusive, and secure societies. And that honestly sounds really amazing, right? I mean, who doesn't want all those things? Unfortunately, a great deal depends on who is defining terms like those and how they're going to measure them. In her book, The Invincible Family, Kimberly Ells warns, quote, equitable and inclusive are elastic terms open to a wide range of interpretations. If deference to equity or equality is required, then young people who embrace the concept of free market systems wherein inequalities are allowed may be tagged as harboring attitudes that are unacceptably inequitable and targeted for re-education. If inclusiveness is applied to matters of sex, then holding specific beliefs about sexual conduct may be assessed as non-inclusive and therefore undesirable. In fact, inclusivity is commonly used to express acceptance of sexual variance. And we run into a real problem of who defines what when it comes to social emotional learning and the organization CASEL. Now, CASEL stands for the Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning, and they're the organization that sets the 5 core competencies or standards by which all SEL programs are measured against and ranked by. In fact, many states won't even accept SEL programs that aren't CASEL approved. So CASEL's been around a long time, since the 90s, and they've always promoted this definition of social emotional learning, which actually sounds really amazing. And that's what makes it the perfect Trojan horse. Not only does it sound like wonderful skills to teach kids, but now that it's entrenched literally all over the nation, their bait and switch can have optimal impact. In 2020, amidst the chaos of the global pandemic and the racial tension, CASEL quietly updated their 5 core competencies and their definition of social emotional learning, which means, again, that all SEL programs that have to be CASEL approved also updated the way they do things in order to stay relevant. So they changed their definition to be a thing called transformative social emotional learning, which is SEL done through an equity and racial lens. They state, quote, CASEL is refining a specific form of SEL implementation that concentrates SEL practice on transforming inequitable settings and systems and promoting justice-oriented civic engagement. This form of SEL is aimed at redistributing power, gee, that doesn't sound Marxist, to promote social justice through increased engagement in school and civic life. Translation, they want to use transformative SEL to incorporate your students into a larger mission of social justice activism using teachers and administrators as community organizers. To quote Castle, transformative SEL represents an as-yet underutilized approach that SEL researchers and practitioners can use if they seek to effectively address issues such as power, privilege, prejudice, discrimination, social justice, empowerment, and self-determination. So instead of using these SEL programs to focus on unity to achieve equality in the classroom, instead they want to focus on resurrecting racism, pushing the narratives of white supremacy and white privilege, and promoting the notion, and I quote, that racialized oppression was foundational to the establishment of the United States. You see, equality and equity are not the same thing, even though they try to make it seem like that. Equality asserts that all men are made equal, not that all men should be made equal. Their definition of equity teaches that you should treat people differently and unequally, like taking the box away from the tall boy and giving it to the short one to make them have equal outcomes. And that's to correct the systemic structural racism that they believe is in every facet of the United States. The focus is on the race-based redistribution of wealth and power, a kind of identity-based rather than class-based Marxism. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is critical race theory, which transformative SEL promotes the tenets of. So critical race theory is a Marxist ideology that asserts that race is a social construct, basically something that's made up by society, used to exploit people of color. Critical race theorists hold that racism is inherent and exists in all the institutions and systems of the United States. They believe those institutions and systems function to create and maintain social, economic, and political inequalities between whites and non-whites, especially African Americans. And if you're a white person, because you exist and thrive in this institutional and structural racist framework, they believe that you have implicit bias because you want to keep the status quo and keep your power and privilege, right? You don't want anything to change, and that you're automatically racist toward people of color. And that's why the schools have to teach your kids these things through SEL because, and using teachers who they indoctrinate through SEL first into believing this stuff, to teach your kids because white parents can't be trusted to raise their kids to not be racist. They also believe that if SEL is taught the traditional way and not realizing that, by not admitting basically that kids who grow up in this system where everything's against them, that they are experiencing systemic racism, they say that social emotional learning becomes essentially, and this is their words, white supremacy with a hub. And that's why SEL's new focus has to be this lever of equity and social justice. In fact, during the 2019 Castle SEL Exchange in Chicago, speaker Dina Simmons says exactly this. I'm going to play this video for you.
So in closing, I would say for this work to happen, we have to apply an equity lens. Actually, you know what? We just have to start seeing what it is. We don't like to say what it is because we don't like to talk about race in this country. We cannot heal our wounds if we don't tend to them. So we need to apply an equity and an anti-racist lens. So I leave you with one question, which is, how can we leverage SEL to create the social change that we need? That is not a question for you to, not just to ponder, but this is an action plan for you. What is your action plan to ensure that we leverage SEL to create the social change we so desperately need?
Pretty right out there, right? So some might see the terms anti-racist and social change as positive terms, but to these critical race theorists, they have different meanings. The term anti-racist isn't defined as what you probably think it is, which is not racist, because I think all of us would agree that that's actually a really good thing. What they mean by it, simply being not racist does not require active resistance to and the dismantling of the system that they believe is all set up to oppress people of color. While anti-racist does, and they want to use social emotional learning to turn kids into social justice activists toward that cause. So the social emotional learning program that myself and another mom, Stacy Clayton, exposed in Utah, which is Second Step, and it's actually one of the most widely used programs in the nation, we saw a lot of this globalist identity-based Marxism come through. Your own Orinda Union School District just purchased Second Step late last year, and it will be used also in Lafayette school districts in grades K to 8. Since this is a copyrighted program, this is not something you can view from the comfort of your home. We actually had to go into the district office, had an administrator log us in, and we had to sit there and look through all of the material, the lesson plans, the handouts, the teacher instructions, everything. We ended up putting together 2 reports. The slide at the end, at the very link at the top, will be where you can find those reports. It was a long form and a short form, and it's just because we knew that not every parent would be able to go in there and look at this, and we wanted to educate our community about what was in this program. So in Second Step, as far as their Second Step themselves, they state on their website that they subscribe to Castle's new definition of transformative SEL. This is right there on their website. And it cites power and privilege, which are tenets of critical race theory, as one of the 3 main social factors for bullying. And in fact, race is something, primary factor Second Step focuses their bullying lessons on. They then proceed to primarily show white people in the role of the aggressor and people of color in the role of the victim throughout the lessons to just cement that idea that white people have the most power and privilege. The program also focuses heavily on social justice activism, particularly for gay and transgender issues. In this slide, children are instructed to choose a disruption strategy, which promotes terms related to anarchy, while also using the raised fist symbolism of Black Power and BLM to convey that message. Second Step even covertly tries to slip in suggestive ideas here. Like in this 6th grade lesson, where one of the examples of specific goals they could make was to work for a social justice organization. Slipped ever so subtly between graduate from high school and learn one new dance routine this month. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was 11, working for a social justice organization was nowhere on my radar. But this gives, little Johnny in 6th grade an opportunity to raise his hand and say, "Teacher, what's a social justice organization?" and have the teacher elaborate for him. In 7th grade, Second Step introduces the idea of consent. Really, it's a common theme of comprehensive sexuality education by stating that the difference between sexual harassment and flirting is whether words or actions bother you or not, if they're welcome or not, right? Students are asked to clarify whether or not being shown pictures of a sexual nature at school was sexual harassment or flirting. And it wasn't that it's always bad for someone to show you pictures of a sexual nature at school. It was, it was defined by if it bothered you. And then the final and most egregious thing that Stacy and I discovered during our review is that there were 2 third-party links recommended to 7th and 8th graders that were not within the bounds of Utah sex education laws. The links loveisrespect.org and rain with 2 N's.org violated parental consent, and if followed would have exposed 12 and 13-year-olds to inappropriate sexual content. Those websites led them to other websites like Planned Parenthood and another one called Scarletine, where they can learn how to have a safe self-managed medical abortion. Pretty bad, right? So those links were eventually removed by Second Step this past October, but it was that revelation that made our superintendent put that program on hold and actually decide, until they could decide whether or not they just completely wanted to scrap it. And they eventually actually did this past November in a 4-3 vote. It was close, but we got it out of there. And some board members just wanted to get rid of the middle school curriculum and just keep the K to 5, right? Because that had to be really innocent. But I actually went an extra time in there myself and just looked at their definitions of empathy and perspective taking. What I found was really interesting, over the course of K to 5, they kind of shifted these words, right? They can manipulate these words to manipulate what they mean with the kids. And it started out by being what you think empathy and perspective taking is, right? Feeling, feeling empathetic and knowing that people have emotions, that you should be kind of sensitive to those, and perspective taking, realizing that people have different ideas than you and that you can still be kind to them, right? You can still disagree. And they would shift that to be, well, now in order to be empathetic, you have to be compassionate. You have to do something to make that person feel better. And sometimes that meant acknowledging or accepting their truth as your own, right? As truth, even if it didn't, really comport with your values and attitudes and beliefs. So you can see that was kind of a thing there. They also introduced multiple concepts and phrases related to allyship, walking in your shoes, recognizing your blind spots, just a few examples. And those all relate to allyship websites, right? In fact, I even found a white paper that talked about if you can manipulate empathy and perspective taking for people, you can turn them into social justice activists. Committee for Children even admit on their blog that they want to use SEL implementation to promote allyship in students. Another Palmer's second step, and really most social emotional learning programs in general, is students are sharing very sensitive topics with each other, either on surveys or assessments by themselves, partnered with a partner or in a group setting. Now many classrooms start their SEL studies for the day with like a circle time, which is basically akin to group therapy without a licensed professional being there. And for instance, the second step third grade lesson, students practice focusing attention and listening while a classmate relates times that they felt upset. And the 8th grade curriculum addresses a minefield of sensitive topics, many of them listed here, that could trigger someone who is experiencing or has experienced trauma in their life. And having students be vulnerable about their feelings in a group setting can really open up Pandora's box. And you wouldn't be able to put it back in regards to students' emotions without providing the guardrails that are provided in an actual therapeutic setting where that licensed professional knows how to protect the student and provide the clarity and closure that that student might need. And not only can SEL assessments be triggering to some students, but they're also collecting a whole heck of a lot of data, a whole lot of sensitive data on our children. Oh, thank you. I was just about to say, I need water. So these are the social emotional learning skills companies like Panorama Education can assess in individual students, on the school or class as a whole, and in curated groups. If you didn't know already, Lafayette School District just recently signed a contract for Panorama services. Panorama, sorry, 1 second. When it gets dry. Panorama uses all sorts of surveys to quantify and measure the following skills in children, listed up there, as self-efficacy, grit, self-management, social awareness, sense of belonging, and classroom effort, which also includes emotional regulation, engagement, learning strategies, and social perspective taking. I've seen the surveys are very leading. I actually have a website called, a YouTube channel called Parents of Patriots, and I dive all into Panorama and some of the surveys. So if any of you want to look, it's Parents of Patriots. I'll also have it on the last slide. And you can see on this dashboard here, they're actually giving students a score. Like, how do you score empathy? And how do you score perspective? Like, really, honestly, let's ask this question. But what these scores do is help teachers, administrators, and counselors know which kids need to be helped along in these skills. It's important to note that they align these skills to CASEL's standards. So all the data Panorama collects, all of it isn't bad, right? A decline in some of other areas that are measured and scored, like attendance, behavior, like office referrals, and course performance, like grades, actually do help them identify children who are struggling and come up with an intervention strategy to help them stay on track to graduate. But these are all objective, clear, measurable goals with like clear thresholds and that are backed by lots and lots of research, while the same cannot be said about measuring social and emotional skills. So some of you who are concerned about all this data collection from third-party vendors may be thinking, well, I'll just opt out of these surveys, or my district doesn't use Panorama, so my children's data is safe, and it's really not that simple. As we do more and more digital learning, this company and these surveys aren't the only ways that sensitive data and other data isn't being collected on your children. All that data equals money, and the education field is a, money trap, right? It's a gold mine for ed tech companies who are scooping up millions of unique data points on each child each day. That's because in 2008 and 2011, amendments to the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, changed the definition of school official to include third-party vendors, a lot of which to measure the success of initiatives like Common Core. And that really increased their access to student data. The 2011 amendments allow the release of student records for non-academic purposes and undermine parental consent provisions. The changes also promote the public use of student IDs that enable access to private educational records. When we do that in light of the fact that many of these online assessment tools use digital education badges and digital currency-like technology, you have to start asking yourself where this is going, and the implications are truly frightening. So student social emotional scores go on national report cards and really into statewide longitudinal data systems that store the data from preschool to age 20, or what they like to call P20. The justification for many states who are implementing initiatives to teach and track SEL skills like this is to focus on building a thing called EQ, or emotional intelligence, to prepare future skilled employees for the workforce. So Forbes notes that hiring decisions that used to be based on schools attended, grades earned, the status of your last employment, the regular things we're used to, have now shifted to more intangible qualities like high EQ or emotional quotient. So 6 Seconds, the Emotional Intelligence Network, seems to think that hiring people based on their emotional intelligence is a way to dismantle the systems that contribute to racism. Note also how the National Association of Colleges and Employers, at their conference this summer, were talking about emotional intelligence. They say, quote, to drive inclusivity in the workplace, leaders must, quote, move fast with intentions and hold managers and executives accountable in their hiring practices. So in considering the recent emergence of environmental, social, and corporate governance scores and the investor impact of that on businesses, are you all familiar with ESGs? What they are? Okay, good. Just want to make sure I don't need to explain it. It's really not a stretch to imagine that businesses' scores could eventually be impacted by how inclusive their workforce is. And will make hiring decisions in the future based on if the candidate's SEL score is up to snuff. Again, you have to ask yourself, what is their definition of inclusivity and how is it being measured? Not to mention that organizations like the Gates-funded Data Quality Campaign and Jeb Bush's Chiefs for Change are lobbying for linking student-level data between education and workforce agencies via the statewide longitudinal data systems I just talked about. They're asking Congress to lift the ban on a national student database, creating a federal student unit record by passing the College Transparency Act. So really, what's going to keep anyone who has access to this score in the future from eventually using that score like China's social credit system does now? To eventually red flag, punish students and their families for not agreeing with their views on things like climate change, gender fluidity, or white privilege. It's a real question we should start asking ourselves. Will our children's social, emotional, or EQ score be able to disqualify them from colleges, getting a job, or being able to get a loan? Don't forget that in 2021, Biden called for the formation of a new National Credit Reporting and Scoring Division inside the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And really, in the hands of those who value equity over equality, I shudder to think how this could be misused against people who don't align their thinking with the government's. So now that I've scared you, let's talk about what you can do. Really, first and foremost, keep your family unit strong and connected. I love that at the beginning of this, they asked me, why do students need critical thinking skills? Have dinner with your kids. I use that time to talk to my kids about the dangers of Marxist ideologies, how bad communism, how many people died in these communist countries, right? It's important for them to be able to recognize the terminology when they're taught it at school so they can kind of talk to you when they see it. It's so important. And honestly, the whole reason these Marxists want to get these children to question gender norms is because they want to destroy the nuclear family, because they know that's the main thing that is preventing them from indoctrinating children. Demand parental rights and privacy protections for your students' and families' information. I would encourage you to fight with facts, not feelings. We see a lot of people, and rightfully so, we're mad that they're teaching our kids these things, but there also has to be notice today I use their own words and their documents against them, right? And that's how you get your community to see this is a real thing and we need to fight against it. Know your parental rights in regards to the law in your state. Do your own research so you can be knowledgeable enough to have an elevator pitch to use. To educate other parents, teachers, board members, lawmakers, the public at large, etc., on the real agenda behind STL programs. And finally, if you can, opt your kids out of surveys, assessments, and curricula that you know will harm them. Really, those who want to teach our children these harmful ideologies know exactly what stands in the way of them and our children, and it's parents like us. As evidenced by the recent assault by the DOJ, the NSB, and the like, they want to get rid of you and your powerful voice. Don't let them. Parents, we need to get involved, fight back, and build that wall even taller and stronger. Thank you.
After Lisa, we'll have Dr. Wilfred Reilly. He's from Kentucky State University, and he's a nationally known author he has 2 books out on race, on basically taboo, and he wrote another book on hoax issues, and he's going to talk about taboo versus reality, claims of CRT versus the facts.
Sounds good. Well, glad to be here. Can you guys hear? First, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Make sure the mic is on here. All right. You got some tips on the mic?
No.
Is it? All right. Thank you, sir. We've all had some mild issues with the mics. Oh, okay, there it goes. Just kind of twisted up here in the mouth a little bit. I'm sure you guys will be able to hear me anyway. What I'm going to open with today actually is reading something from kind of the opposing team, which is Ibram Kendi's book, Anti-Racist Baby, currently number 3 in the country. I think if you're interested in what critical race theory is, this provides one of the best short summaries of it possible. Then I'll talk about the problems with these ideas. So, okay, this is Anti-Racist Baby by Ibram Kendi and also, I suspect not coincidentally, Ashley Lukashevsky. So, and I want you guys to listen closely to this. Anti-racist baby is bred, not born. Anti-racist baby is raised to make society transform. Babies are taught to be racist or anti-racist. There's never neutrality. Take these 9 steps to make equality reality. Okay, so these are the 9 steps. 1, open your eyes to all skin colors. See race as much as possible. Anti-racist baby learns all the colors, not because race is true, But if you claim to be colorblind, you deny the truth in front of you. Somewhat contradictory there, but this is written for 3-year-olds, so we'll move on to number 2. 2, use your words boldly to talk about race. So discuss race and also sex, which comes up in this book as much as possible. No one will see racism if we only stay silent. If we don't name racism, it won't stop being so violent. That's point 2. Point 3, always point at policies as the problem, not people. Some people get more, while others get less, because policies don't always grant equal access. This is probably the core point of quote-unquote CRT, that any gap in performance between people indicates some kind of racism, no matter how subtle. If you're an educator and you notice that there are more black students failing than whites, and perhaps more Hispanics than black students, it's because you're a racist. So this is what Kendi says. Every gap in performance is due to racism, and if you disagree with me, you're a racist. That's the argument. I just saved you $29.99. Or $14.99 for anti-racist baby. But I mean, so number 4 repeats this. He says, shout loud, there's nothing ever wrong with the people. Even though all races are not treated the same, we're all equal, anti-racist baby can proclaim. Number 5, constantly celebrate all our differences. So they've got like the thing at the top of the page and then the little rhyming epithet or couplet that goes with it. So anti-racist baby doesn't see groups as better or worse. Anti-racist baby loves a world that's truly diverse. Knock down the stack of cultural blocks. This is number 6. Anti-racist baby appreciates how groups speak, dance, and create as they choose. Anti-racist baby welcomes all groups with their own unique views. So, 7, confess as much as possible when you are being racist, which is defined very broadly, by the way, in this children's book. Nothing disrupts racism more than when we confess any racist ideas we might sometimes express. So all gaps are due to racism. See race as much as possible, and continually, sort of Alcoholics Anonymous style, interrogate yourself for racism. All right, 8, grow to be an anti-racist. Anti-racist baby is always learning, changing, and growing. Anti-racist baby stays curious about all people and isn't all-knowing. So this is a lifelong trip that anti-racist baby is taking. 9, believe that we shall overcome racism. Anti-racist baby is filled with the power to transcend, my friend, and doesn't judge a book by its cover until the end. So that is the youth reading portion of the program. And this ties pretty directly into some of the major quote-unquote CRT ideas that I'm going to be talking about today. So, as most of you no doubt know, I'm Wilfred Reilly. I'm an associate professor of political science at Kentucky State University, and I'm the author of the books Hate Crime Hoax, Taboo, and the lesser-known scholastic book, The $50 Million Question, as well as a decent chunk of what was recently the #1 selling book on Amazon, The 1776 Project's Red, White, and Black, which takes a view on the good old USA a bit different from Dr. Kendi's. So I'm here today to talk about something which should be fairly timely as a topic, and I appreciate all of you guys coming here today, listening to a whole series of great panelists. But my theme is sort of CRT more broadly in the context of some examples that citizens in your community have been sending to me and the specifics that the other presenters have been outlining. So I actually got a bunch of these from people in the community. Thanks to Paul, especially for sending some of these along. But the Mirador online student newspaper apparently wrote what became a regionally famous article on cultural appropriation, which included things like the singer Katy Perry wearing a Chinese dress and the pop star Miley Cyrus twerking in a video. So pretty typical example of one of the ideas that we'll be talking about here. Lamorinda Weekly, I have no idea how high profile a publication that is, but ran an article called Lamorinda Community Works to Defend DEI Work. And they give here some of the standard justifications that are used for DEI. A local college student in the community at St. Mary's apparently asked something that's kind of touching from his perspective, but that really gets into some of the major defenses of critical theory. Why are people in my community so opposed to telling the truth? Says Nick Harris, St. Mary's College senior. Something similar from gender and race sociologist Cynthia Ganot, who's a professor at St. Mary's and roughly as unbiased as one would expect. Her take is the resistance to critical race theory is invariably the result of fears, not facts. CRT is only a theory, and it's the specific theory that explains systemic racism. Most people had never heard of it before Christopher Rufo appeared on the Tucker Carlson show, claiming incorrectly that it poses some kind of threat to the United States. I'm not sure why anyone would object to the teaching of a theory. Ganot also notes that this initiated a national fear campaign based on misinformation and mischaracterization, led chiefly by panicked parents and educators. So, and there's quite a lot of this. I mean, one I got from Paul is the actual strategic document, Capo Lindo's surprisingly large CRT program, and so on down the line. So this is something that we're beginning to see in many or most communities around the country. This seems to be no exception. And as it happens, I'm familiar both with the topic overall and with CRT issues specifically in California. Just a few months back, I had the honor of becoming part of what's sometimes called the Montana Mafia on Twitter. So along with the whole passel of other people, James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, Melissa Chin, Michael Schellenberger, currently running for governor of California, Eric Smith, I was flown out to Bozeman, Montana. Academic conferences are usually in remarkably pleasant locations for whatever reason, by the journalist like Chris Rufo to discuss how to fight CRT nationally. And we've been kind of wargaming around the idea since. And many of the specific scenarios that we used came from real situations pretty close to here and certainly around the urban West, the West Coast of the USA. So today, barring loud boos from the audience, I'm going to follow pretty much the standard format for a business talk, I guess. I'm going to break down what CRT is not, break down what it is, point out some of the big empirical flaws in these theories, give some general tips on how to respond, as Mrs. Logan did, and then get more locally specific, and I guess looking at our setup here, take some audience questions. I think we all will. So let's get started. First, it's important to define what critical theory or critical race theory is not. As with many hotly contested topics, there tend to be a lot of what you might call smoke screens here. So we've just heard some of them, in fact. Just as I find that no racist actually says, I am a member of the alt-right and I don't like blacks and Jews, and no minority bigot ever actually says, I am running a de facto segregated school for black or native boys, educators tend to be pretty canny about what CRT and what critical theory more broadly is, and whether they're teaching it at all. So first, CRT, or critical theory, is not simply, quote-unquote, teaching honest history, as young Mr. Harris apparently believed that it was. I've actually conducted at least a partial review of some of the major high school and college textbooks and curriculum materials for my next book, and as part of 1776 Unites, which is kind of the black business and social science community's response to the New York Times 1619 project. And I can tell you in that role that there's almost no educational curriculum that doesn't touch on, for example, slavery. There are differences in how much context is taught, and whether slaves are depicted as, for example, being sold by white or black traders, obviously both of whom existed, this kind of thing. I mean, you see a difference from the left to the right. But every text, from the 1619 project itself over to former President Trump's proposed patriotic curriculum, discusses this topic. I think very few Americans don't know the country had slaves at one point or racial conflict at some point in the past. The same is true for the Indian Wars. This isn't going to be a lengthy focus of mine, but I checked, and my understanding is that California has a fairly solid Indian education program. Most states do. Virtually no high school student doesn't know that Crazy Horse and Custer were both famous generals, that you really would not have wanted to be captured by either man, that they fought each other, so on down the line. So it's just not true that the average Lamorinda mom doesn't want a full-on CRT curriculum because she fears honesty or something like that. It's also not true, not practically and honestly true, me sainted old priest would put it, that CRT is a very advanced theoretical framework that's taught only in law schools. So this, to ad-lib a little, is kind of the second response, like, no, we don't teach CRT, nobody teaches CRT. Ironically, both of these exist at the same time. The claim, whenever you debate any kind of Marxist, is we don't do that, and when we do, it's the truth. So the second point is that nobody actually teaches this stuff, that it's confined to obscure seminars in Yale law and this kind of thing. This is probably the most common rebuttal argument. And while this may very technically sometimes be correct, it's an argument, like many arguments on the left and more than a few on the right, that's just based on cleverly playing around with words. So when someone says this, they're not saying that many schools don't have far left curricula based around Howard Zinn or Nicole Hannah-Jones, modern SEL as an obvious example. I mean, that's in almost every school I looked at. What they're doing is very technically, specifically arguing, Jesuitically arguing, if you will, that the version of CRT that's taught in the schools should technically be thought of as something else. A common example is critical pedagogy. That's a term that might be used. SEL might be used. Radical pedagogy, white fragility theory. I always get the Brazilian guy's name wrong, but Ferrarian pedagogy. 1619 curricular content. Rather than as pure critical theory. That's all that's being said. This is 1619 praxis. It's not critical theory. It's just a nonsensical non-response, in my opinion. This is a distinction without a difference, even to me, someone capable in many ways of wonking it up with the best of them. So that leads to the question, what is CRT in any practical sense? What should you as a dad or mom be looking out for? And to me, and all of my sources are cited in this speech, and they're also available if you contact me offline. If you just Google Wilfred Reilly, it's Wilfred Reilly. I mean, the first three things that come up on my website, Facebook, and Twitter. So if you contact me, I will respond to you. But there are three basic, really core themes of modern critical ideology, in my opinion. The first idea is that all kind of facially neutral systems, so all systems in society, facially neutral systems, I think is a good technical way of putting it, but prison for rapists, say, or the grading systems and SAT examination that might be more relevant to the educators in the room, all these don't simply exist as some kind of accident. They're set up to oppress minorities and the poor. As a quick note, by the way, this is the core idea of Marx and of many leftist thinkers before Marx. I don't want to call everyone I disagree with a communist, although many of them in fact are communists. But I mean, the core Marxist idea, and this goes back to Rousseau, this goes back to Foucault, but what we think of as society is kind of a trick. Like, the Rousseauian idea in political philosophy is the opposite of what our country is founded on, sort of practical Adam Smith and John Locke and so on, the social contract. Rousseau was a rich party kid in France, and he thought the social contract was a trick. That people had been happy in primitive society and had been kind of conned into forming into larger societies by, for example, those with property, those with money, successful war leaders, who felt that they could take advantage of others in a more controlled sort of central world. So this core idea of leftist thinking goes back to the very beginning. And what you find if you're debating someone about any of this stuff is that almost every theory is just Marxism with the big bad, if you will, replaced at the end. So critical race theory is a form of what you could call vulgar Marxism, but with the rich man replaced by the white man. That's it. Feminist theory is the same thing, but with the rich man replaced by the man. society is set up to privilege and advantage men, sexually please men, so on. Women have no power within society. That's essentially most feminist writing, at least in the past 40 years. I'm tempted to ask how the men in the room feel about this idea, but let's not waste any time. And then this goes on into many different sectors, all jokes aside. Our queer theory, for example, argues that the world is set up for the benefit of, I guess the term would be cis-het people. You're now getting into other fields like fat studies. There's a highly professional journal, the Journal of Fat Studies, read every year by, I'd assume, about 40,000 people if you look at normal rates of circulation. So in the CRT space, though, the one we're focusing on, the idea is that facially neutral society is set up to oppress black people, indigenous people, poor people. You often hear very clunky terms like BIPOC. That means black, indigenous, and other people of color. So, I mean, this is old school Rich Delgado stuff in theoretical terms. I mean, his quote is, racism is every day, everywhere. Racism is the structure of society. It's not incidental. The cruelty is the point of society. This is a radical theory in the literal sense. So that's point one of pretty much every radical theory. Facially neutral systems are set up to oppress. A second argument is the one that made me read Kendi's book to the audience. But it's that all performance gaps between people in SAT scores, for example, indicate racism. They can't mean anything else. So it literally cannot be that Asian kids study 1.78 hours more per day than black or southern white kids, and we've known that for decades. That is not the case. That is not what explains the gap in scores. So this is Kendi's whole point, and in fact, second book, Stamped, as well as apparently Anti-Racist Baby, there's kind of a dichotomy that's created here, right? So all gaps have to be due to either inferiority, that's his actual language, and I've never seen any indication it doesn't mean genetic inferiority, or to oppression. So it's this duality that's created that's in fact very powerful. You either believe, what was the quote from ARB, some people are worse than others, or you believe that there's hidden, subtle racism out there everywhere, even if it's really challenging to find. And an important part of the flip here is that if you don't believe that the math SAT is literally oppressive, if you take this seriously, that means that you are a racist. Because you believe in the other, and again, I banter, but it's not a joke. You believe in the other option, which is genetic inferiority, because there are only two options. So if you're not an anti-racist, you're a racist. That is the exact duality. So it's what you call in the debate world, I sometimes participate in a Kafka trap. Lisa in the third row, are you an evil racist?
Yes.
Oh, we kind of. Well, okay,
This is what my friend does. This is how she fights it. She goes, yes, I am a racist.
Yeah, no, that actually is the most effective response. But
It'll go away.
well, actually, I do think that was a very skilled debate move. But I do think there's an even better response when people ask me my pronouns, for example. I say something that and again, I cut my beard a couple days ago. I'm a 200-pound man. I mean, so I view the whole process as silly, for want of a better word. So I generally say something like, as a feminist, I disagree with the paradigm that created that question. It's just totally baffling. And I mean, I am a feminist in the second wave sense, women should be executives and the like. But I've never heard an effective response. So I think that's almost the next level. But yeah, if you accept the duality, your two options are just saying, yeah, screw off, I'm a racist, which is what Lisa in fact did, or saying, no, I'm not, and then falling victim to the question, or the comment, that sounds like what a racist would say. This is, again, while I'm summarizing books, the entire argument of white fragility. If you are white, you are very fragile and probably a hidden racist. What if I say I'm not? Well, then you're a racist. I mean, that's it. None of this is especially complex. What's kind of surprising is how much social power normal middle-class citizens, much like the people in this room, have allowed it to gain. That's something that genuinely amazes me. I think with some things like police brutality, there really is a debate. You can talk about whether the gap in blacks versus whites shot by police is due to higher crime rates, which is what I believe, or it's due to residual racism. I think people on both sides believe what they're saying here. When it comes to people saying that Dr. Kendi, and I mean no personal insult, but is one of the country's top 25 geniuses as of last year, the MacArthur grant, or people talking about the gender stuff, like there's no way in an intimate situation to identify a woman, was a comment recently made on television in a debate with the right-wing personality Matt Walsh. I don't think anyone actually believes that. Again, the question is why it's been allowed to spread so much. I think people simply worry that calling the person saying this a fool would lead to the end of their career. It's that simple. But that's the second point. If you don't believe in anti-racism, you're a racist. And the third shared point, which I think I'm going to actually cut about 5 pages out of this because I think the other speakers have already defined this almost perfectly, but is the idea of equity. So this again infuses this whole philosophy from the elite legal academy down to the grade schools. We've all seen the fence graphic used in textbooks and on Facebook and Twitter. At least one of the other speakers used it, Neil. So in the image, there are 3 people trying to sort of sneak or peek over a fence to watch a baseball game. And they can't all see. And the solution is that the team, I guess, gives everyone as many boxes, like cartons, 1, 2, 3, to stand on as they individually would need in order to see. And now I will say from that kind of center-right business guy perspective, one obvious solution here would be everyone buying a ticket for $5 and going inside the local minor league stadium. This is never brought up. But at root, this simple graphic gets the idea across pretty well. Equity basically means that there should be exactly proportional representation of members of every race and sex group in every situation, regardless of performance, as I think many in the Asian American community, for example, are starting to learn. And if there are not, steps should be taken to make this happen. That's equity. There should be proportional representation. If there's not, racism is at fault, and steps should be taken. So, I mean, again, the teachers in the room, I'm pretty sure you've been in some of these situations where there may be more men suspended than women, or black kids suspended than white kids. The general assumption is that you are a bigot and there's something wrong. The argument that there could be a higher rate of violence among, say, working class students or males or black students as versus their compatriots is off limits. It can't be discussed. So that's the equity baseline. And right now, a lot of other bad ideas are sort of grafted onto this 3-part ethno-Marxist root. So there's BLM, that's the Black Lives Matter narrative of widespread police murder. I think that's starting to fade away a little bit. I mean, we saw Joe Biden the other day declare we were never at war with East Asia and speak out in favor of refunding the police on a massive scale. But there's the broader race war narrative, mass interracial violence with whites responsible for most of it. Again, I mean, these stories, George Zimmerman, Dylan Roof, so on, are constant in the mainstream media. It's worth noting that violent crime between blacks and whites is actually 3% of serious crime, and it's 80% black and white. Neither group is at risk, and it's truly odd that the left has decided to make an issue out of this. This is a chapter of my book, Taboo, and what is not at all a blatant plug. It's worth noting, by the way, this is more a dinner speech line, but the person most likely to kill you is your husband or wife. That absolutely unchanged across all cultures, all time. There actually are some interesting differences there. It's your current husband, indicating perhaps stupid male brutishness, and it's your ex-wife. So, be careful, gents. At any rate, but I think going on with these, skipping a few, but I mean, there's the idea of systemic racism, univariate white privilege, whites alone have significant social privilege, cultural appropriation, now even the idea that biological sex is a complex and tricky business. CNN ran a headline recently that was literally titled, "It's more complicated than you might think." The Lancet recently referred to women as bodies with vaginas. I mean, just, it's an odd place that feminism has gone to. But in education, in your schools, almost all CRT praxis comes from this perspective. So if you're looking at almost any system, the educational system, the criminal justice system, the first question will be, do any sex or race or class performance gaps exist? And if so, the system must be immorally biased, and the topic for you as the educator or the duty sergeant or whatever will swing to how can we get equity? The 3-part framework here, the goal of society is oppression to some large extent. Any gaps show bias, I guess would be 2. And 3, the solution to bias is enforced equity. This 3-parter can be brought to the table in almost literally every situation. And it can be used not just in teaching, but for example, by your HR department as a tool for ranking or criticizing the teachers. So again, we already went through the suspension example. That's something that's probably going to become part of your dossier as an educator. Are there grading differences between students of different races or sexes in your classes? Well, we know what the reason is, don't we? The SEL conversation I thought was especially scary. I mean, my job before higher education was working on a trading floor. And it was very smart, competitive, productive citizens, but I don't think any of them would have gotten an EQ score over whatever the equivalent of 70 is. And there's a big place for that in society. Not everyone can be a minister, although they do better work than we did. But so that's CRT. And an important point here, CRT has long been considered fairly fringe, even in left-leaning academia. So there are other models for how school systems and courtrooms operate, with names like culturalism, attitudinalism, institutionalism, that are in fact far more popular among what I would consider, I suppose, serious people. I'm myself a culturalist in the Thomas Sowell tradition. But CRT specifically has long been associated with kind of the Marxist, women's studies, clove cigarette smoking fringe, even of academia. And a big reason for that is that many of its claims bluntly seem to be wrong. So again, I want to keep this limited during a half-hour speech, but serious social scientists like John Ogbu, Heather McDonald, June O'Neill, John McWhorter, the OG himself, Tom Sowell, Roland Fryer, have long, many of whom are black, men and women, by the way, if this matters at all, but have long pointed out that this sort of kindy argument that any gap in performance has to be due to either genes or hidden racism is almost idiotically simplistic. Groups that are different in terms of big characteristics like race and region also tend to differ in terms of dozens of what we could call cultural and situational variables. So to give just the least controversial and most obvious one I can think of, the most common age for a white guy, a Caucasian American male, is 58. The most common age for a black guy is 27. It's not especially a shocking statistic, but it is interesting, and it bears on everything from wealth gaps, which we often hear about, to crime rate differences on the right. Every serious economist to dig into these specific fields, like education and sociology, and look at this question has pointed out that adjusting for pretty basic things, how old people are, the region they live in, wages are about a third lower in the South, have been through almost all of history, any aptitude test or IQ test score, that may be a little awkward to discuss, but it's silly to pretend that doesn't predict what you're going to do in life, closes almost all group gaps, at least as things like income. By the way, just out of curiosity, what do you guys think is the richest group in the USA?
Boomers.
Yeah.
Boomers. Well, racial group.
Nigeria.
Old rich people. Correct. All right. Sir?
Correct. Indian American.
Indian Americans. All right. Nigerians are solid top 10. Didn't quite get the prize. Same thing for Jewish Americans, Chinese Americans. I mean, there was a race at the top, but it was won by Indian Americans. Well done, although neither of us is a representative of our racial category. Absolutely nothing to do with either of our incomes. But so the most quoted thing I've ever said as an academic, though, is simply that 8 of the richest 10 groups in the USA are made up of people of color. Broadly defined. I mean, Arab Americans would fall into this category, I suppose, if we're debating the CRT folks. I mean, Muslims are among the most oppressed among us. But East Indians were number 1, making twice what whites do. The Indian income has not been between $126,000 in any of the 3 most recent years. Taiwanese Americans were number 2, then Filipinos. Either South Africans or Nigerians fairly frequently crack the top group. I mean, from Africa. One of those groups is racially mixed, one is made up of black Africans. And the CRT side of the debate, as far as I can tell, as someone who travels and discusses this, absolutely cannot explain coherently how this could happen. And they often seem to essentially lie about it. You'll hear things like East Asians and Nigerians are very close to whiteness, which is an unusual sentence. But I mean, probably 2/3 of the math educators in the audience could explain it easily by adjusting for 2 or 3 things using Stata or R. I mean, what are the college degrees people are bringing to the table and so on down the line. I can't imagine that anyone thinks that a Nigerian guy experiences less racism than a black American guy because bigots can somehow tell, A, and they prefer black Africans, B. I mean, so that's an interesting sort of counterexample. But the same kind of thing is true of white privilege, by the way. I've actually administered a professionally designed survey on this topic, and about 70% of privilege, quote unquote, someone's score on a 100 or 110 point scale, that's actually very interesting. It includes questions like, have you ever gone to bed hungry? Have you ever lost a physical fight? Have you ever had an unpaid internship, which is actually a sign of privilege? But the majority of your privilege, around 70% of it, seems to be just pure social class. I mean, a very simple metric. I mean, it was how much money you make that we went with, and how much your parents made if you're under your early 20s. I mean, so it literally is, you wouldn't say something like how rich your daddy is, but it is very close to that. This far outweighs race, so on. If I recall correctly, sex, women still experience some real problems in the business world. Sexual orientation, religious faith, even things that you'd probably never expect, like body weight and growing up on a farm. We had an urban-rural variable, quite seriously. All impacted privilege more than race itself did. So many of the core claims of crit theory collapse similarly, white fragility and so forth. I'm actually interested in checking this out as a paper, codifying the major stereotypes for each group and asking members of each racial group how they feel about them. For example, Black Americans, how would you feel if someone said that your group is very high crime? And seeing if whites are any more fragile than anyone else. I would tend to suspect most people would be annoyed at being criticized about their stereotypes by angry strangers. We'll see. We'll also see how publishable that is. But there's a reason that this was considered fairly fringe for a long time. And I think right now we're seeing to some extent a very important battle between leftists and traditional liberals as to who's going to control their side of the paradigm. I mean, here in suburban California, I don't know how many rock-ribbed Republicans there are in the room. I'm not one. Okay. Raise your hand if you want. I wasn't. All right, fair enough. I'm probably going to vote in the next election, but I don't think that necessarily bears on the point that even on the left, if you listen to, say, Bill Maher or Joe Rogan talk, this was considered to be fringe, almost nonsensical stuff until a few years ago. The start of the racial reckoning in 2012, the enhancement in 2015, George Floyd in 2020. None of this, in my opinion, has done anything positive for Black people, or for that matter, poor whites or Latinos. But nonetheless, attitudes have changed, at least in public, at least sober, at least on the record. But a lot of this is a professional argument from my own niche field. I think the key question a lot of you guys might have is, so this controversy is going on, what can we do about it? I think first, a very quick note on experts. We often hear things like, all of the experts disagree with you on CRT. Or, are you an elementary school sex ed teacher? Well, if not, why not leave this up to the experts? I mean, the presentation is here that essentially any professional degree group is a bunch of genie in the sense that NASA engineers are that should not be challenged. And I think this is a bit silly, it's worth keeping in mind. I mean, gender studies is not engineering. So a quick way of looking at expertise would be that, in my opinion, as someone who was a boss for a while, there are two types of experts. So type 1 experts are people with a trained, unique technical skill that has to be constantly maintained. And you probably should listen to type 1 experts. A surgeon would be a type 1 expert. If your doctor says you need to do something about the old ticker, it's probably a good idea to listen to them. Pilots are type 1 experts, so on down the line. Astrophysicists I'd probably give you, it's a bit softer. But type 2 experts are essentially just decently smart people with degrees and with general skills like writing and research and conversation. And most truly bad ideas, in my opinion, come from politically biased type 2 experts. When you look at a field that leans extremely far in one direction politically, like journalism, and where people don't necessarily have any unique skill that you can't, as an upper middle class parent, learn yourself in a couple of weeks, if they're saying things that sound like nonsense, they very likely are. That's a good and hopefully useful point. So with the second group of experts, I strongly encourage the audience to just ask questions like, does what I'm hearing seem logical? Can I understand the technique, univariate regression or something, that was used to get there? If so, you can criticize what you're hearing pretty effectively. So I guess another point, going beyond the note on experts, the first step toward responding to this stuff is just doing what we're doing today and what I hope will happen more in the near future and in the questions portion of the couple hours plus. But recognition, understand what the concepts involved are, understand what's meant when someone calls for, say, total proportional equity. That doesn't mean conventional equality. And I think by this point, most of this audience and many people in many other audiences know what it means and are strongly opposed. In a conversation before the start of this forum with the representative of the Free Independent Thinkers Society, we were talking about how the percentage of Asian American students admitted to the UC system dropped incredibly over the past couple of years. It's from, I believe, 23% to 10% or 11%. This is equity in practice. If Asian Americans make up 11% of California, they damn well better make up 11% of the UC system. Right now, you might be surprised to learn that Harvard is 17% African American. One of the universities, this of course does not match test score patterns in the country, although the black students there are quite well qualified overall. But I mean, the goal, one of Harvard's top hit of list goals for the past couple of years was increasing diversity. And they did. That's what equity is. If the USA is 15% black, Harvard should be 15% black regardless of what the test boards are. In fact, they've gone overboard. America's 12% black and Harvard is 5% ahead of that. So, now obviously we live in a democracy when it comes to these equity questions. So individual school boards and districts can often vote on what they want to teach. Some may choose the critical approach. But I suspect most might not. I suspect the average Hispanic American parent, if they knew what modern gender theory is, something that I think people are becoming increasingly aware of, is not going to support this. We talked about this on the way into the event. And following up this speech with some reading that you can share with others, some understanding of what a Kindi-inspired praxis might actually mean will be very useful. A second technique is listening and responding to those legitimate points which might come up during any CRT conversation in your district. But recognizing that critical materials are almost never the best solution to them. So if someone says that they think the curriculum in many West Coast districts is a bit light on the history of slavery, that could in fact be true. But the response to that doesn't have to be a pivot over to the New York Times most left-leaning writers saying that everything unique about the USA came out of slavery, and largely ignoring the full history of the South, the Wild West, the Gold Rush, so on down the line. There are multiple sort of mainstream centrist to center-right organizations now that oppose racism and wokeness. I think this is a very important development in society, actually. So FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, I happen to be one of the executives there. We have an entire series of handouts and videos focused on the whole history of slavery, including the fact that the Western world ended it, something often omitted from the dialogue. The 1776 Unites Initiative, which was sort of the minority, as I said, business and social science communities' response to 1619, has all grades, curricular content, that covers everything from the first minority millionaires, as opposed to an entire focus on defeat, to the fight by people of all races against slavery. It's worth noting, by the way, one of the things about the battle against historical racism in the USA is that we won, the good guys won. Segregation ended in 1954. In California, I think most segregation laws were off the books by the 30s. Since 1964, racial discrimination has been illegal by law per the Civil Rights Act. We've had pro-minority affirmative action since the Philadelphia Plan in 1967. So an underreported fact, because it doesn't make any money for anybody, at least on the other side, is that we did overcome. And that also should be taught. So, yeah, there's not a simple one-note story here. Listen to what people say, but consider the whole gallery of useful solutions out there. And finally, in the context of California or any other specific state, consider what you can legally do. The law in many or most states may mandate some kind of ethnic studies, but it also generally bans any form of racism or racial discrimination or any labeling of any particular race as bad or flawed. Keep that in mind, look up the local statutes. Many of the things done in surprisingly early grade classrooms are, to me, extremely psychologically abusive. I thought about actually making you guys do the privilege walk in here. So stand up if you've ever been divorced. Take one step forward if you're financially worried. But I figured it really was no business of mine. But the same sort of thing, or if you are not heterosexual, take 2 steps forward. It's extremely common in, for example, 7th grade classes. So the legality and efficacy of that, again, can be widely debated by the public, and I think I know how most members of the public would fall on this. So if you choose to, you can teach about CRT as one of many paradigms of how the races interact, along with the ideas of culturalism and Western progress and non-race critical theory and whatever else. But you can't make your students confess to past sins or list out the accurate negative stereotypes for their group or engage in privilege laws. An analogy might be that you can teach about the Bible in a history or religion class, but you can't teach that the Bible is the infallible word of the Christian God and keep your job. And that sounds like a fairly reasonable standard to me. Teachers have a duty to show students all the content of value that exists out there to prepare them to be competitive, useful members of society, not to blindly indoctrinate them. So walking that line is what they do. I suppose what we do as educators, and making them do it is very often going to be your role as a parent. So that's it for me today. Go forth and do good.
So we ran over a little bit, and so if anybody's filled out the cards, if you haven't, we need to take a few questions. Bring those up to the front.
Thanks a lot.
Well, I'm just going to.
I have to leave in about 10 minutes.
Yeah. I'm just thinking we can just-
We have an event down south with Trevor Loudon. He is the producer of the movie Enemies Within the State. So it's happening today at 6 down in San Jose.
How far is San Jose from here?
1 hour.
50 miles.
Oh, okay.
1 hour.
It's an overnight trip.
On a horse?
During the commute.
That's fun. Yeah, California's roads have a unique reputation as parking lots. Kentucky's have a unique reputation as backwoods Appalachian trails, though. So, I mean, people probably criticize the same 5 or 6 things everywhere.
Okay,
I just like Utah.
Well, I'll make another announcement. Next week, we have Robert Kennedy coming to speak at the VAC, which is the organization I run. If you are interested, vac.org. Go to vac.org. Robert Kennedy Jr. will be there speaking on his new book, The Real Anthony Fauci.
How do you feel about Anthony Fauci?
Do you need to ask?
No, but I mean, we fill some time with conversation.
Well, in 2005, BBC ran an expose on him having used black foster kids. It's very dear to our heart at every Black Lives Matters, having used black foster kids in an experiment, HIV drug experiment, without their consent, and without the consent of the foster parents. And this is the BBC, so not known to be a right-wing
And
organization.
what was the evidence in support of that?
The BBC seemed to think there was a lot of evidence, so yeah. I can refer you to their thing, yeah. Again, this is not my words. I think Robert Kennedy will talk about that, in fact.
Hasn't he greenlit a few of these bizarre experiments, like the one where they fed beagles to insects?
Yes.
I actually don't have a far-right take on Anthony Fauci, but I mean, that's a surprising resume for someone so universally beloved, at least by the media.
Okay, so let's get started on some of the questions. First one is, if one believes we still have some work to do on equality, even if you don't believe we're all inherently racist, nation built on racist ideologies, and if you want minority students to feel welcome, add value in a largely homogeneous and affluent community, what would the panelists recommend teaching students on race issues?
That's a great question.
I think
Okay.
I would recommend teaching the actual truth, what's kind of funny about this is that the almost universal comment from CRT advocates is what they are teaching is the truth. But I think
I actually really dislike handheld microphones. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
That's a personal pet peeve. I might have an elbow injury. All right. So I think that what I would do is just sort of tell the truth. First of all, I don't think the United States was built on racist principles. I think that when the United States was built, everyone was a racist. More simply put, I mean, if you look at the descriptions of the writings of anyone from Tipu Tip, the famous black slave trader, to Jefferson, everyone who's around at this time, they were all bigots. They were all intensely in-group prejudiced. They were generally religious zealots, in our terms, of course. Some of the zealotry might be a little helpful. But sexism, homophobia would have been almost incomprehensible terms to them. They wouldn't have understood the idea that men and women were expected to universally play the same roles in, say, the home or business. So I think that the early Americans are a little embarrassing to us, but in fact, the framework they set up is one of the more magnificent in history. I mean, the rules like the protection of free speech and so on, I don't think have that much inherent racial content whatsoever. You know, the slavery is mentioned incidentally once, if I recall correctly, in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Maybe a few more times in the 13th, 14th, and 15th, of course. But if I were teaching minority students, I would focus on the positive contributions of their group to the country along with everyone else, and I think I would treat them like human beings. I would assume that the ultimate form of anti-racism in reality would be barely noticing race and treating people as more relevant conditions, like how they're performing in school, maybe social class, if you have a free lunch program, so on, dictated. Isolating people and saying to the whites, well, you're white, and to the blacks, well, you're black, and so on down the line. This is California, where there are a dozen large ethnic communities, Vietnamese Americans, Filipino Americans. I don't see that as likely to increase, you know, what we call comedy in the law. So I think I would treat the students like everyone else. I think if I were the principal, I would immediately fire any actually racist teachers, and I would talk through the good and bad of history. It's also, final line for me, that to be a long talker, but I mean, it's also worth noting that nobody alive now did the things that happened historically. So I mean, unless there's still, if there's a law that is, I mean, obviously there's some jokes about, you know, age and time frame and so on that people have made when that came up. But I mean, I think you're vehemently agreeing. Like, obviously that's not the case. So there's, anyway, I would just treat them like anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing we've done and I found out in our research is the single most indicator of educational prowess or your literacy rate is the home life, the nuclear family. You can just point immediately, you've got a broken family, and so it's for EBLM, it's fatherlessness. That's the key issue. And so the question is not, is this a race issue? No, it's a cultural ethnocentric issue because the culture is broken, and therefore, why is it broken? And in every indication we've seen, it's because the government is intruding in the culture. And the sooner the government gets out and the churches and charities get in, then things will return to normal. But it's not going to be overnight because the government has been destroying that culture for the last 40 years, sadly.
I would say just not make assumptions about anybody. I think that that's part of the problem, right? We make assumptions about whites because of the color of the skin. We make assumptions about people because of the experiences that they've had, instead of realizing the potential that people have inherently and their ability to overcome those things.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think one very final point about the cultural issue that was just brought up, this isn't just a black problem. So I mean, I think a lot of these issues really have to be tackled along group lines. I mean, if you want to talk about fatherlessness, and I do, the current illegitimacy rates for the large ethnic groups in the USA are 72% for blacks, about 70% for Native Americans, 60-some% for Hispanics. It's hard to break out each group. Puerto Rican Americans, for example, are at around the black rate, if I recall correctly. It's about 40% for whites. It's 36.4%, about 50% among poor whites. The only exception is Asian Americans, who are holding the line at around 20%. It's worth noting that the panicked Moynihan report that was released in the 60s saying the American family was collapsing was released because the fatherlessness rate in the black community went from, I think, 16 to 23%. So every American group now is doing worse than that. So, I mean, I think those things, like when you say, if you see, there's an element of low-key racism to a lot of well-intentioned liberalism, in my opinion. And I'm not fooled into thinking there isn't some nasty stuff on the fringes of the right, but I see less of this with conservative buddies who used to be athletes or soldiers or farmers, something like that, than I do talking to friends at very upscale dinner parties, quite frankly. I mean, like saying, how am I going to treat the black kids differently because I know they're all fatherlessness, or they're all fatherless. I mean, there's an element, my initial response to that would just be the word bro. Like that's a very biased assumption in a number of ways. But yes, the two-parent families would do more than anything else for the problem in black communities, working poor white communities, Native American Indian reservations, just across the board.
So the next question is for Lisa. I'm a parent at Capolindo High, and how do you get parents on board to fight back? They turn a blind eye. It's very frustrating.
Honestly, the thing that's united most of the parents in our districts has been the gender issues. The books with all the pornography in them. I think once you start threatening their ability to parent and their rights, it comes back to what I said in the very beginning of my presentation. What falls in the school's purview and what falls in the parents' purview. Once you kind of tell them your fundamental right to raise your own offspring is being violated, I think that's a big unifier.
How do we raise awareness of these realities about CRT, SEL here in the Bay Area, where most people believe these points are all Fox lies, believed only by Trump supporters?
I can take that. Yeah, do you want to take it?
No, because I was thinking I need to leave, but, okay, so just a quick comment on so quick thing on my background, and I think it's clear, I need to make it clear. Even though my ancestry dates back to 51 AD when St. Thomas came to India and converted my ancestors to Christianity, my immediate family are all Marxists. My father was a communist and a Marxist. I grew up in a Marxist home, basically. Let me assure you that CRT is based on liberation theology and Marxism. My uncle was the chairman of the World Council of Churches, my father's brother, okay, oldest brother. So this is, the plan is to infiltrate the churches, infiltrate the schools, infiltrate universities, infiltrate the politics, and that's why we have trouble out in speaking, and he did enemies within the state. So it's a plan and it's out there, and if you don't recognize it, it's because you've been bamboozled, but the reality, it's part of the plan. And it wasn't hidden. In fact, if you go back and read the writings of the Frankfurt School back in the 1930s, you'll see all that clearly depicted. And then there's a great book by Manning Johnson, with the Communism Color, and yeah, basically he was an ex-Marxist black person. He talked about that. So I gotta run. Thank you all. If you want some information or a thing, I'm gonna leave that right here. And thank you.
I just want to say in regards to that question, all the stuff, the videos I put out on my YouTube channel, Parents and Patriots, I use all of their source material. I bring up, Castle wrote a document about transformative SEL. That's where they said the racialized oppression stuff. I use their own words and documents against them because it is out there. It's just, they don't even hide it anymore. It's completely in front of your face. So I think just really bringing people's attention to those words and documents, because you can't deny it once it's in front of your face.
Yeah, I think that's why the individual examples point from both of you guys was so powerful. Like, I mean, when Neil said there are books in school libraries that have open pornography in them, that was something James Lindsay said to me in an online argument, and I initially thought this was sort of a joke. Like, this is just the right going off about healthy sexuality again. But then, I mean, you look at it, it's like the oral sex issue of Genderqueer was one of the most popular books sent into middle and high school libraries over the past couple of years. And I tend to suspect there's often just a box checking function. Like if you're the head librarian, you're not passionately concerned with this issue. You need 3 books on gender, but 2 of them happen to be porn. I mean, so I think if you just take pictures of, there are 3 specific pages in, genderqueer that come to mind. Be careful about posting them on the internet for legal reasons. But I mean, if you simply present that to other parents, I think people are going to say, well, that's disgusting. This does border on the illegal. Maybe we shouldn't be showing that to 6th graders. One of the things that's been an issue recently, I mean, COVID is the ultimate example of this, is the refusal of people on either political wing to listen to anything the other political wing said. So my all-time favorite statistic is that the people who are least worried about COVID-19 were unvaccinated and not in very good shape. The people that were urban, rock climbing liberals were vaccinated 4 times and were terrified. And I'm thinking, after 1 shot in reasonable shape, that there might be a middle ground. So it's sort of the same thing with this. Like when there's genuine offensive material, just as you do, take a picture of it.
Yeah, and if we have the same issue in Utah. My friend went to her hairdresser, he's homosexual, and she was like, oh, we're finding all this stuff in the books. And he's like, it's a whole same far right, argument. But she said, literally, go to stoputahporn.com and look at it. And he did, and he's like, oh my gosh, like, this is serious. Like, and it doesn't matter if you are gender questioning or if you're really secure in your heterosexuality, no kid should be exposed to porn. Regardless of who writes it. So.
Yeah, that's another thing. I mean, when people were talking about the "Don't Say Gay" bill, quote unquote, in Florida, I was asked a couple times on television, would you be cool with heterosexual teachers not discussing their sexual relationships with kids? And my answer, I'm not a homophobe. My answer was yes, of course. I mean, so yeah, there are many, many things. Discussions. So the actual Florida bill, it's the Parental Involvement in Education Act, I believe. It prohibits talking about 3 things with people under 8. Sexual intercourse, like actual sex. Gender identity, like the idea you can change your gender. And sexual orientation, presumably mostly homo or heterosexual. And raise your hand if you object to 8-year-olds not being taught about these topics. If you object to them not learning about this anymore. All right, yeah. So I think there was actually some polling done on this. Ben Shapiro, the Daily Wire, paid to have a survey done that didn't ask any questions. He didn't trust the polling agency. He just wrote down the language of the bill and asked people if they supported or opposed it. Whatever you might think of Big Ben, I mean, 60% of African Americans, 62% of whites, 66% of Hispanics, I believe it was, opposed it. So that is democracy, however you might feel about democracy. I personally think a good king might do a better job, but that's a niche opinion. Sir, in the back there.
Yeah, so this is my view of what anti-racist means, and it means calling out things that I think are going down a path that are offensive to minority groups. So what would be your view of a 7-year-old who has 2 dads, who's asked to talk about what he did over the weekend and shares about his 2 dads?
I would have no problem with that at all, but like one thing I would say, and I mean, many questions about this that are intelligent and worth listening to come almost from a legal perspective. So the bill, when I read through the text of it, I'm a lawyer by background, although I'm a pleasant guy despite that, but when I looked at the text, I mean, it bans instruction, which is a term of art generally referring to teacher-led work about these topics below 3rd grade. I can't imagine a situation, in fact, if you talk to like Christina Pashaw online, anyone involved in Florida public relations or legal work, the idea that a kid saying, hey, my parents are gay, would be punished in some way, I don't think is realistic at all. For that matter, I can't imagine that a teacher saying, I went with, my lover, well, my girlfriend, wife, special friend, whatever, Julie, to a rafting event this weekend. That is not formal instruction. You could argue the bill was a little too broadly written, but I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that they're targeting the gender unicorn there, not Julie. Good question. I mean, that was the one real objection to the bill, but I don't see that happening ever.
Yeah, I think you and I have a different view on the likelihood of that happening. I mean, I will give you credit because your definitions of what CRT is are pretty specific, and it's like defund the police. I don't know anybody, literally, I don't know a single individual who wants to defund the police.
What about the person who wrote the?
Black Lives Matter.
Well, no, I mean, I think the response to that, because again, I do think good faith, which from what I see you're engaging in, is very important in these conversations. I would agree the majority of Democrats, like union steel workers in my old neighborhood, don't want to defund the damn police. I don't even think Joe Biden does. But I mean, like, if I were going to give a glib answer to your question, I would say, what about the person who wrote the New York Times lead editorial called "Yes, we mean literally defund the police"?
But we're here today talking about teaching that's going on in Lamorinda.
No, but I'm saying, like,
I happen to, no, but if we're gonna truly talk about the teaching that's going on in Lamorinda, then we shouldn't be talking about CRT, because it's not happening.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
It's on my phone. I
Yes,
can
it
show you
is.
tons of stuff.
yeah, I think that any conversation like this, and again, any space like this, we're all citizens. Anyone should be able to agree or disagree. And I mean, all the comments on both sides have been, for most of them, been surprisingly polite. But I mean, I think that comments like that, generally, in my experience, do come down to the definition of what CRT is. So I think that if parents in the room were going to come forward with documentations of, for example, modern left-focused SEL in the classroom, that wouldn't be very hard to find. I mean, like, the local newspaper ran a piece that was essentially called Lamorinda, if I have that correct? Lamorinda. I want to pronounce it with a bit of a early accent trill, but I mean, basically, I mean, the piece was called, needed DEI measures supported by community here. So whether DEI is CRT often just falls into semantic world. I don't think that the things that I'm describing would be difficult to find in most school districts.
The board policies in Lafayette specifically focus on white privilege and institutional racism. Those words are in the board policies.
The Acalanes Unified School District, the high school district before high school, they specifically changed the word.
I don't know how you can deny that. It's in the board policies.
Right, I think where people get confused, right, is we're mincing words. And obviously, they're not teaching the exact legal theory as written. What they're doing is pulling the tenets out of it, what the main beliefs are, and manipulating those in the education
Lori
system.
Watson was brought in to speak here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I think it would be interesting to ask the empirical questions that, and again, either of the two perspectives being expressed could be correct. I absolutely have an opinion which one is, because I'm an arrogant person and think it's mine. But, I mean, you simply could ask people, for example, do you believe that there is an institutional system designed to, like, just the Ibram Anti-Racist Baby is, again, the #3 book in the country. It would not be very difficult as a social scientist to sit educators down and ask them questions like, do you believe that all or most performance gaps between groups are due to racism? I think that whenever this has been done, educators score as one of the most, quote unquote, woke groups in the country. So, I mean, and last comment from me, and I do want to hear last word to you, and then I think Paul wants to get some of these written. But I mean, if you just simply ask some of this, like, are all performance gaps due to racism? Do you think that extensive white privilege exists? Educators generally test as very, very inclined to believe these things. So like when I looked at this for 1776, one of the top two, I don't want to exaggerate, but curricular additions in the United States was the 1619 Project, appropriate for all grades. Another one was Howard Zinn. People's History of the United States. I mean, Zinn's an open Marxist. So when you look at some of these fields, like when you look at Pew 2004, the media leads 93% to the left, academia, sociology, I believe 98% to the left. Whatever you want to call it, you do see those effects. I don't think people are just reacting to lies on Fox or something like that.
go ahead. So I've put 4 kids through the school system. I have 2 high schoolers at Campo. Actually, in the last room, we pulled over to De La Salle to the Catholic school to get them out away from this issue. But my friend's son at Camp Linda was made to wear a white privilege necklace by the teacher.
Like a necklace? What did it look like?
An example. The younger daughter transferred away from Campo because they were screaming out the racists during the whole, that wanted the teacher to out the racists in the classroom. The Camp Linda, I think, in other words, I guess my point is, I think the train is so far out of the station on this one that something will have to be done at the school board level. The Camp Lindo Parents Club hire Lauren Watson, a consultant whose core competency, I always felt like the only one who actually went and read her CV, where her core competency is critical race theory, right? We all did. And they're revamping and going through the curriculum, all the clubs, and all the sports to make them all
Have them on
DEI
tape saying
compliant.
exactly what they're doing, and when I called them out on it, I said, why are you so focused on the sports teams? They removed me from the Zoom call.
Right, so we've got.
And I have that on video, I have so much of them on video.
And can I say
Despite on
that-
all their stuff.
Here's a recent edition of the high school magazines, and you can just look through the articles and see that it is intensely CRT, DEI, SEL.
Well, I think your point is a really good one about it's a distinction without a difference to say that it's not CRT, because it's teaching those concepts, that the train is pulled out.
No, look at the school website, here's their.
It's a
their-
distinction without
and
significance.
everything, right
I
on
don't even
there.
understand what that means. I appreciate Dr. Reilly being one of the few individuals who has actually defined what CRT is, because then we can have a conversation about it. The ambiguous concept of CRT, which sort of shape shifts, I can't even engage on that. So to say it's a distinction without significance, I don't even know how to respond.
Those were his words. He used
Yeah,
that in his talk.
I think that where I would leave this, because I mean, good.
If I can just, if the first bullet on CRT is defined as every gap is exclusively attributable to discrimination and race, we have a ton of common ground. We have a ton of common ground. And you may think that there are a lot of people who believe that. I do not. I do not. I think there are certainly some. I think that's a very narrow group. I don't think that is a dominant viewpoint. I certainly don't here in Lamorinda. Do I think that there are aspects of it that color? Yeah, I do. And frankly, I think you probably do as well. So, I appreciate that. I'm not going to convince 90% of this group. I think probably 90% don't have kids in the district. So, what is my point being that I don't know that, my view would be that there are many here who don't have an awareness of what's going on in the schools, but are quick to jump to, yeah, CRT is being taught in the schools. And it's just not. It's just not.
What is called
It's not
equity
at
is
least
CRT.
defined by Dr. Wright.
What is called equity is CRT.
Okay.
Well,
Let's Dr.
Okay.
Ryan speak.
Well, I think, so I mean, Paul, what you mentioned, so I think I've gotten a range of, let me, to start at the beginning here. First, I guess one question as a quantitative guy would be, could you raise your hand if you have a kid in the school district?
Or
Okay.
that.
Yeah, or you teach in the school district. Okay, yeah, parent. Okay, so I mean, I think that a lot of this stuff, so I said final lengthy comment to you, and I'm generally a man of my word. I mean, I think that a lot of this stuff is pretty easily vettable. That would be my kind of short take. You're right, probably most mainstream Democrats do not believe that every single gap in performance, at least privately, is due to racism. I think, though, it would not be very difficult, and again, I mean, so in terms of the materials I've gotten from the school district, they seem to be saying that kind of thing pretty often. I have my strong suspicions, and I think knowing the political breakdown of educators, I don't think this is unusual. I think this is something I've seen pretty frequently. I would be more than willing to talk to teachers. I'd be more than willing to survey teachers and see how many of them believe this. Very few school boards have allowed that anonymously. But I think that's something pretty vettable. And the key point for me is, just as you say, most people on the left, let's say, are not crazy. I think the same thing's obviously true for the right. I don't think people are imagining that it's unusual to have their kid wear a chain that says white privilege on it. Something that's happened fairly often across American schools, privilege walks, etc. I don't think people are imagining that that's damned weird because they are conservative. So I think this is something people should, and this is kind of what's happening here, sit down and talk about. But I think in terms of any group or voice vote, the large majority of parents would probably vote this stuff out immediately.
If they knew what it was.
Yeah.
I think parents are just late to the game. We're finally waking up and realizing, and I agree with you that maybe only a minority of people feel that way, but they're overrepresented in the educational
It's also one of the things that gets into this, and by the way, Paul, I guarantee it's my last comment. But you guys are, I normally charge thousands of dollars an hour to come argue with people. But so, it's been a great group. The idea, so one of the things that makes this hard to discuss is the incredibly poisoned political atmosphere in the USA right now. Like, I'm pretty openly on at least the center right, so I tend to blame the blue team a little more. But so it's important to kind of, once you realize that what you are hearing about what's going on in the schools, for example, is often not true. I think a lot of parents became interested in school board politics during COVID. Probably 30 young, successful female friends of mine have said, this is the first time I've really gotten to be home with the kids since the marriage in 7 years. I've never been interested in the curriculum. It's crazy what they're learning. Now I think there's a real chance for parents to make a difference and say what they want to do, run for the school board, for example. Have those debates there. I do hope that we don't fall into like the too crazy teams zone again. So like all teachers are pedophiles, this kind of stuff that you see on Twitter. That's obviously not true either. But the bunch of people sitting in a room and arguing about what these topics mean is actually a pretty healthy step toward getting out what the majority of the democratic citizenry does not want in. It's up to you, Paul. You're the boss man here.
Okay, just last question. We need to move on through these questions. We're a little bit behind.
Are you calling on me or no?
Yeah, I'm calling.
Okay, thank you, I wasn't sure. So I'm a public school teacher, and I just retired over the span of these issues because I felt it wasn't ethical for me to impose these things on young children. I'm a kindergarten teacher. And I just would invite you all to look at A is for activist, A is for activist, advocate, abolitionist, ally, actively answering a call to action. Are you an activist? ABCs is my bread and butter. And this is a book designed to teach children political concepts. And it's all very non-traditional, let's say that. And so I have a setup here of a number of books, and I invite you to come and look at them. They're purchased at Barnes & Noble, and they're available in Contra Costa Public Schools and California. So this is a big moneymaker in publishing diversity, equity, inclusion, and the gender issues, gender orientation and sexual identity. And I was trained all last year on CRT by your tax dollars, all last year, every Friday for 90 minutes in my school district, and many districts did the same thing because we were Zooming. So that's the truth. That's the truth. And I have lots of screenshots on my cell phone to prove it. I'm not lying.
Where did you teach?
I taught in West Contra Costa, but let me just tell you, my friends here in Lamorinda confirm the same things are going on here, in Brentwood, in San Ramon Valley, in Orange County. My friends are statewide, and we're telling you this is happening. And the governor will say it's not. Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurman, will say it is not. Your tax dollars are paying for it.
Thank you, Lisa. So the next question is, how can I take my evidence, assignments, questionnaires, books, emails from teachers to a reporter or Ben Shapiro?
It's honestly hard. It's hard for me to get my material in front of conservative or even left. It's interesting. I've actually been covered more by what are considered leftist news organizations covering my material to try to debunk it than other people. So I think just you have to grow. For me, it's been just continually educating people in my community. I built platforms on Twitter and Facebook, and you just have to get people talking about it. The fact that I was able to kick this social emotional learning program out of our district really frustrated a lot of people. So I guess people said, well, what kind of information do you have? And honestly, now they're making Loudoun County parents sign a disclosure agreement that they won't talk about any of the stuff they see when they go in to look at second step, for instance. So people come and be like, oh, you have all this information. I think just we got to get it out in the public. Yeah.
Yeah, my advice, the short-lived answer would be contact a reporter and send it to them. I mean, now obviously I'm gonna give some more useful detail there, but if you're talking about a local newspaper or something like that, I mean, pretty much everyone's email and Twitter handle is on the masthead. If there's a conservative paper in the area, you lean right. I mean, obviously that would be, the target destination for that. I also will say that there are people on Twitter, Facebook, and so on that kind of specialize in CRT and educational fights. So if you look up like chalkboard heresy, for example, chalkboard heresy, Chris Rufo, obviously. There are people, Peter Boghossian, who has gone through a whole series of things with the higher educational system. Really, really enjoyable guy. I mean, those people will actually respond to you and have pretty big platforms. So I would look up people in the Gabs Clark, for example, who was one of the first moms to get involved with this, who's actually a friend of mine, but whose son, and this again, I mean, whatever you want to call it, her son was almost failed by his high school for not saying that he was an oppressor. So Gabs is black, but her husband's white. So she has two sons. One looks black and one looks white. The white son was asked to acknowledge his white privilege and said no because I'm black. This is a very true, well-documented story. And she, again, has, definitely gone on with this for quite a while and has, I think without too much extreme bias, just like this is what's out there, helped a lot of parents out. So Gabs Clark, chalkboard heresy, people in the educational space, Bonnie Snyder, that would be my tip. Also, there are kind of e-magazines that lean a bit right, that focus on education, College Fix, anything like that. They'll take a look at what you have as well. So.
I have an answer. There's on Twitter, there's a Twitter account called Libs of TikTok.
All right.
They've become very famous recently. It's a clearinghouse for this type of material. It gets published several times a day. Teachers have been fired through this Twitter account. And I will say that the Lafayette School District is going to be featured soon because I've been in communication with the person who runs it. And there's some of those documents are going to come up. But if you have anything like that, Libs of TikTok, all the people, Ben Shapiro, everybody you mentioned, go there to kind of get the information.
So the next question is, how much of the school day is devoted to SEL in your research, Lisa?
So Common Core brought in social emotional learning, right? They created national standards for cognitive skills and then said, we're going to embed SEL into these academic core subjects. So part of it's just natural inside already the standards that they're learning. Now districts are starting to adopt programs, and then what they'll do is they'll dedicate, say, once, twice a week, 20 minutes in the morning to SEL, or 20 minutes during a particular period of the day. So that's kind of what I'm seeing.
How much math, PE, and the like is sacrificed for SEL?
Well, they're integrating that into that too. Look up a company called Playworks. It's a PE program where they're putting in SEL and CRT stuff. What were you saying, math and what else?
Math and PE and the like.
Well, yeah, a lot of it, other stuff is being sacrificed. Anytime that you're taking away to dedicate to other subjects besides core academic subjects, they're not learning those subjects. So I don't know how much, but it's enough to be significant. And look at the scores of our school districts. A lot of kids can't read and do math.
Can you reiterate the programs, curricula used in Lafayette and Lamorinda?
Second step, the one I just completely went over in my progress, I know, or my presentation, I know for sure second step is being used here. I don't know about any others. I didn't see any of the documents that were sent to me.
Okay. This is kind of a long one, but I don't know if I can. From an Oakland liberal, wants to take the left back. There's Scottish and Irish in me, so I'm to blame for the appropriation of my culture. LOL. I listened to.
Okay.
This question.
Hold on, I'll just give her the mic.
That might be best. Go ask your questions.
Is it on?
Yes.
It's on. Okay, yeah, I was just listening to Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter answer questions before I came. And one of the questions happened to be like, would they recommend their students to go on to certain, be part of academia? And anyway, McWhorter ended up saying that not anymore, particularly in his particular venue, that apparently he's been called a fascist by students there. With James Lindsay on one of his podcasts, he mentions that at UC Berkeley that they're starting to, or have been giving social justice questionnaires to applicants.
That is a problem.
And that's not only there, but apparently down in San Diego, that's coming up, that unless you pass the test, you won't even be interviewed. I'm not sure, I wrote something else.
Yeah, so then you go on to say, recent UCB
Oh, yes.
PH defines white teachers as post-colonial do-gooders
Yes,
who
yes.
teach white, who
That
teach with gentle violence.
Yes, that I happened to come across PhD thesis. My youngest daughter went to Mills, which I feel has gone the way of Evergreen. And they're now, anyway, they're now being taken over by Eastern University, and there's apparently the Burns section of it, that's social justice, and they're connecting with the city of Oakland. So apparently they want to be a force in that. But anyway, in this thesis, basically it's saying that white teachers are post-colonial do-gooders that teach with gentle violence. And this is somebody that, this is a 2019 thesis, anybody can find it on the web. Anyway, so my concern, I went to Cal, I knew Hank DeSuvro, who was the one who started you know who Hank DeSuvro maybe is, anyway, he's the one who started down, I think through USC, the liberal law school that actually Kamala Harris's husband went to. So I have a whole history here in the Bay Area.
So your question is.
And my question is, I don't like to see this happening to my universities. What at this point can people do?
I mean, it's really hard. The Marxists, even the Weather Underground people, Bill Ayers, they kind of took over the teacher colleges. And that's kind of how all this, really started. They started capturing all the institutions, and those are the people hiring the teachers. And I honestly don't know the answer there. I think we just have to retake over, almost maybe create a parallel system. Maybe that would be my thinking, is that we have to start creating new. I mean, because it's not just the programs. I mean, we're talking even with accreditation, strategic planning, all of these areas and companies and associated with it have been captured. So we almost have to create a completely different.
Yeah, I guess that's the University of Austin.
Right.
One in Austin,
Yeah.
One very quick jump in there. I mean, so I do think, like, when you talk about actual communists, like Bill Ayers, going into education, I don't think people, Bill Ayers was a weatherman. I don't think people understand how far, so there's a lot of BS on the right too, but I don't think people understand how far left a lot of mainstream social institutions are. Like the media, there's a famous poll of national news media journalists from Pew, came out in 2004, like as mainstream as possible. It's like Pew, Reuters, like the Eurodesk, like together. And they found that 93% of journalists were leftist, liberals, or left-leaning moderates. So like 7% were anything on the right. This is pretty common. University professors are a bit more liberal than journalists. So like there's a recent study, maybe from Econ Live, but they looked at the most and least friendly like quantitative social science fields. I just looked at my area for conservatives, and the friendliest field was economics, which is only 5-1 liberal. And the least friendly field was sociology, which is 33.5-1 liberal. So what do you do about this? I mean, the alternative institutions idea from, Hillsdale and the trad right to you, Austin, I think is a good one. I also think that just that spur to compete, just those 10 right-leaning colleges will have a big impact, because any college that got rid of the woke idiocy and decided to focus on publishing quantitative research would immediately become one of the top 10 in the country. The colleges that do that, like MIT, U Chicago, so on, are now like beating Harvard half the time. So I think eventually, University of Alabama, some right-leaning school with a massive endowment is going to say, we've had enough of this. We don't care about this. Let's start competing. While everyone else is wasting time, let's hit that top 20. So I do think support parallel institutions, of course. Watch what develops. I also, by the way, I mean, literally last sentence, but when people say don't encourage your kids to go to college, I'm not going to ethically advocate for that. I mean, someone recently described the old right, white and black, as go be a king warrior, and the new right is go be a plumber. There's all this criticism like, hey, maybe you should try out trade school for 1 year. What about the Marines? Nothing at all wrong, certainly with the Marines, but I mean, if you get into Yale, you should probably go. But I will say, it depends where you go. There are a large number of colleges, like the SEC area Southern schools, the historically black colleges I was surprised to find, but I haven't been fired, I got tenure. All the A&Ms, there's usually 1 or 2 in any state, the pure techs like Caltech, community colleges, if you want an alternative to trade school, those generally aren't woke at all. I was a lawyer and a trading floor guy. I got a PhD. I wanted to see if my intelligence was a match for a pretty good school in Illinois. And when I got the PhD, I quit on the floor and applied for sales floor guy, really, but applied for jobs and got one. So I mean, outside maybe 20 or 30 top 50 really woke institutions, I don't think your kid's gonna have a nightmarish experience